They launched at 22:03, for F4 zeroing off the deck into a Pacific night. So clean it felt surgical. No moon, no overcast, just hard starlight and the long, dark skin of water below. Call sign stitched the radio net, Viper 1 Reyes, 2, 3, 4, and the AWACS voice like a metronome somewhere above the black. Fuel checks, alt checks, a turn to heading 270. Routine made of ritual, ritual made of muscle memory. Reyes kept the flight in a fingertip spread, gauges green, the faint glow of his Rio scope painting his periphery. Far behind them, the carrier's deck lights shrank to a line of cold embers and were gone. Picture clean, AWACS said. No factor traffic. Angels 20, push 275. Clean nights make liars of men. At 22:17, the first noise crept into the net, just a smear of static like torn cloth. Viper 2 tapped his mic twice, a lazy good luck superstition they'd never admit was superstition. Reyes smiled into the mask. It was the kind of night you could forget the ocean had teeth. Then Viper 3 said, "Lead, I've got..." And the rest of the sentence fell into a hole. "Say again, 3? Reyes asked. Silence. His Rio leaned forward. Spikes clean. Scopes clean. But... He stopped, adjusting the gain. What is that? A seam had opened in the darkness ahead. Reyes could not have pointed to when it appeared. One moment it was only night, and the next there was a line. Not light in the normal sense. More like a crease, a long pale thread stitched from horizon to horizon. Faint as breath on glass. Every star it crossed seemed to bend a fraction, like a reflection in rippled water. AWACS, Viper 1, Reyes said, voice steady by training. Paint advise. Do you have any emitters west 275, Angels 20? Negative, Viper. Picture remains clean. Viper foreslid half a wing closer. Lead, do you see that? Reyes didn't answer. He moved the nose a degree left, then back, testing parallax. The line did not shift with his view. It simply existed. No bloom, no glare, no source. His altimeter ticked. His airspeed stayed honest. The night felt dishonest. Lead, I'm showing a faint return, his Rio whispered, as if the thing could hear. It's not a contact. It's a wall. Viper 2 laughed in the way men laugh, when they want the room to be normal. Copy a wall. Roger that. A wall at Angels 20. Maybe we can climb it, get a view. Knock it off, Reyes said, sharper than he meant. He rolled 3 degrees, lined the flight on the scene without deciding to. Training kept the stack crisp. Habit kept his hands calm. Curiosity moved everything else. At 22:21, the radios went dead. Not a pop, not a fade. 1 second the net was there, and the next it was nothing, like someone cut the wire to his skull. Even the hiss vanished. Reyes felt the absence in his bones, the way you feel when sound stops in a big room, and your ears are still looking for it. His Rio snapped fingers in front of the panel, as if that could conjure a tone. We lost them. We lost everybody. Reyes put his glove on the throttle and understood, later, that this was the last choice he made alone. He could turn left and go home with a punchline about Aurora and broken radios. He could climb, call it a day, add it to the 1,000 small lies pilots tell themselves to keep the sky tame. Instead, he eased the nose 1 degree down and flew straight for the seam. The moment they crossed it, the night changed temperature. Not warmer, not colder, just other. The canopy reflections shifted. The stars warped into thin, bright needles, and the sea below stopped looking like water and more like dark glass pouring from an unseen edge. His altimeter spun half a tick and then steadied at a number that felt wrong, because it was right. The road of light, he would call it later, when men who didn't believe in such things asked him to be precise. A strip through the night that was not sky and not ocean, laid out with the arrogance of surveyors. No edges he could see, no surface he could name, just a certainty in his bones, like a runway he'd landed on 1,000 times, telling him, this way now. He banked to keep the nose on the thread and realized Viper 2, 3, for no longer at his wingtips. Their strobes, their shadows, their small reliable noises were gone, as if the world had pocketed them. 2, he said to the dead radio. 3, 4, The cockpit was a church after the congregation leaves. His Rio said very quietly, "Lead, I think we're already inside it." Reyes did not answer. There was nothing to answer with. The horizon had left. The gauges had kept their manners, but his body knew a different truth. The jet wasn't flying any more so much as being carried. The lights of the seam rose, or he fell, or both, and the stars arranged themselves as if obeying a rule older than navigation. At 22:23, according to the log he would never see again, Captain Elias Reyes followed a path that wasn't in any chart, into a silence that wasn't any man's to break. The silence lasted less than a minute, but inside the cockpit it stretched into something shapeless and endless. Reyes's gloved hand rested on the stick. Every muscle in his arm locked against the urge to bank away. His eyes flicked across the instruments, altimeter steady at 20,000 feet, airspeed true, engine temp green. Everything ordinary, everything routine, except that the ordinary world had folded behind him. The seam of light ran ahead, sharp and unwavering, like a chalk mark scratched across the universe. He had lost his wingman the moment it appeared. "Two!" Check left. He said into the mic out of reflex. "Silence." He twisted the frequency knob, shifted to guard. "Flight, this is lead. Come up on guard." Nothing, not even static. A dead circuit. The airwaves had been shaved clean. His Rio, Lieutenant Carter, sat hunched over the radar scope, the faint green glow painting sweat across his cheek. "They were right there," Carter whispered. 200 yards, tight spread. They didn't drift, they didn't break. They just blinked out. "Keep scanning." "I'm scanning." The scope's lying. It's showing us an open sky, no returns, nothing. Like we're the only aircraft in the hemisphere. Reyes glanced left, then right. Empty night. No strobes, no afterburner glow, not even a hint of silhouette. Just his jet alone in the tunnel of starlight. The first thing to go wrong wasn't visual. It was a rhythm. Pilots live by cadence. Engine noise, cockpit rattle, the faint syncopation of instruments ticking. You feel when something drifts. Reyes realized he hadn't felt a vibration in 30 seconds. The canopy should have trembled with slipstream. The stick should have carried the subtle buzz of airflow. Instead, the jet rode smooth, frictionless, like they were skimming through oil. Carter muttered, "This isn't air. We're not flying anymore. Cut it out." Reyes's tone was sharper than he intended, but Carter wasn't wrong. The gauges all behaved, but the body knew the truth. Their wings weren't biting sky. They were being carried. "Pull us out," Carter said suddenly. His voice cracked. "Bank, right? Just roll us out of it." Reyes put pressure on the stick, enough to tip them 5 degrees. The nose dipped slightly, gauges answering like good soldiers. But outside the canopy, the seam didn't shift. The line stayed fixed, horizon to horizon, indifferent to his corrections. He rolled harder, 10 degrees. The stars themselves bent with him, then straightened, like scenery painted on glass. The seam held steady. "Jesus," Carter whispered. Reyes leveled the wings. His jaw ached from clenching. "We stay on heading. Until we have something solid to turn to." The words were calm, but in his gut, he felt the weight of a decision already stolen. 22 minutes into the sortie, his fuel gauge hiccuped. It dropped 100 pounds, then froze, then ticked back to the proper mark. Engine pressure fluttered. The altimeter rolled 20 feet down, then back up. Every instrument pulsed like a heart caught out of rhythm. Carter slapped the side of the radar. "It's bleeding. The whole panel's bleeding." Reyes didn't answer. He saw it too. The numbers weren't failing. They were echoing, as if they were receiving signals from 2 different realities, and couldn't decide which one to obey. Then came the whisper, not through the radio, not through his helmet, through the cockpit itself, like the canopy was a drumhead vibrating to a voice too low for ears. A murmur without syllables, a current of sound that seemed to pass through his teeth. Carter ripped off his headset, as if that would help. His pupils were wide, fixed on the seam ahead. "Lead, they're still with us." "Who?" 2, 3, 4. I swear I heard." He froze, listening. Reyes listened too. For a second beneath the murmur, he thought he caught it. Fragmented call signs, clipped words, the familiar rhythm of his wingman's chatter, all blurred together like a tape stretched thin. Then it was gone, swallowed by the cadence of nothing. At 22:25, his clock skipped. One instant it read 25 minutes past. The next it read 26, the second hand jumping like a nervous twitch. A minute had gone missing. He tapped the glass uselessly. "Fuel looks light," Carter said, voice thin. "We should be at 21,000 pounds. We're at 18. We've been burning clean." Then where the hell did it go? Reyes had no answer. He only knew that the seam was brighter now, drawing them deeper. The jet shook, not turbulence, something internal. A single convulsion that made every rivet shudder, every panel groan. Carter grabbed the dash, swore. Reyes checked the gauges. Still green, all normal, nothing wrong. But the shudder left a taste in his mouth, metallic, bitter, like chewing on a coin. "Something just passed through us," Carter whispered. And then, for the briefest moment, Reyes saw them. Not in formation, not at his wingtips, but inside the seam itself. 3 faint shadows, blurred silhouettes of F4 suspended in the line like flies in amber. Their navigation lights flickered weakly, strobing in unnatural rhythm. He couldn't tell if they were ahead of him, behind him, or in some direction the human eye wasn't built to measure. 2, 3, 4. Reyes shouted into a dead mic. The shadows trembled, stuttered, broke apart into shards of light, and vanished. Carter let out a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. "They're gone. They're already gone." Reyes gripped the stick, so hard his hand cramped. "Not while I'm flying lead." But the cockpit, the seam, the universe itself disagreed. They weren't a formation anymore. He was alone on the road. The horizon had always been a pilot's anchor. Reyes grew up tracing it with his eyes, even in simulators, trusting its steady line as the last truth when instruments lied. But 28 minutes into the sortie, the horizon stopped behaving like a horizon at all. It didn't bend with his roll. It didn't blur with the faint haze of atmosphere. It became a fixed stroke across the world, a scar of light too straight to be real. Reyes nudged the stick. The jet dipped 5 degrees left. The altimeter ticked obediently. But out the canopy, the seam of night and sea didn't tilt. It stayed rigid, as if the entire cockpit had been mounted on a gimbal and the universe was the simulator's projection screen. Lieutenant Carter stared out his side window, breath fogging the glass. "Sir, the ocean's not moving." Reyes followed his gaze. Below them stretched the Pacific, a black mirror so flawless it reflected the stars like a perfect copy. But the waves weren't breaking. There were no swells, no foam, no moonlight shifting on currents. Just an infinite sheet of unmoving glass. "We're still showing airspeed 450, Reyes said, forcing calm. "Then where's the wake? Where's the texture?" Carter's voice cracked. "The ocean looks dead." Reyes checked his artificial horizon, the gyro spinning faithfully. But when he compared it to the line outside, the two disagreed. His instruments claimed a bank. The world refused. The conflict gnawed at him. Pilots learned to distrust their senses, to lean on instruments when vertigo struck. But this was the reverse. The instruments were consistent. Too consistent. The world itself had lost the ability to shift. "Knock it off," Reyes muttered, more to himself than to Carter. He trimmed the nose, centered the gauges, tried to pretend the lie outside the canopy wasn't there. But it was there, and it was watching. At 22:29, the cockpit lighting faltered. Not a bulb flicker, but a lag, as if every action carried a half-second echo. Reyes tapped the throttle forward. The jet responded, but sluggishly, a dog obeying after hesitation. The canopy reflections trailed his movements, delayed, like frames spooling out of sync. "Are you feeling that?" Carter whispered. "Feeling what?" "The delay." Reyes pulled gently on the stick. The jet climbed, but a fraction late. His body knew the delay before his brain caught it. The sensation was intolerable. A fighter obeyed instantly. Delay meant death. "Jesus Christ," Carter muttered. "It's like the air's gone thick." Reyes said nothing. He tightened his grip until his gloves squeaked. If he admitted Carter was right, it meant they weren't flying anymore. They were being flown. The stars began to shift. Not drift, not well overhead, but shift. Their positions jumped slightly every few seconds, like chess pieces nudged by an unseen hand. Orion's belt stretched, shrank, reformed. The Pleiades scattered, then pulled together again. It was as if the sky was correcting itself badly, struggling to remember its own design. Carter cursed softly. "It's a dome. God damn it. It's a dome and it's breaking." Reyes swallowed the bile rising in his throat. The word dome made too much sense. The stars weren't above them anymore. They were part of shell, painted and repainted every few seconds, the paint cracking under stress. The Pacific reflected it perfectly, a mirror dome inverted beneath them, until Reyes couldn't tell which side was up. For a heartbeat, vertigo nearly took him. He closed his eyes, fought the urge to trust nothing. The instruments hiccuped again. Altitude jumped from 20,000 to 19,800, then back, as though caught between realities. Fuel ticked down another 200 pounds in a single blink. The vertical speed indicator showed a climb when he was level, then corrected itself. Carter slapped the dash. "It's bleeding again. Everything's bleeding." Reyes forced his voice level. "It's noise. It'll clear." But it didn't clear. The canopy glass itself seemed to ripple, bending the light of the panels. Reyes saw his own reflection stutter. Face doubled, tripled, eyes misaligned. He blinked hard. His reflection blinked half a second later. He almost tore the mask from his face. At 22:33, the whisper returned. This time it wasn't faint. It was layered. Not words, but patterns of tone, rising and falling like the sonar wails. It reverberated through the jet skin, rattling the pedals, humming against his helmet. Carter's hands clamped over his ears. "It's inside. It's inside the metal." Reyes tried to call AWACS again, even though he knew the net was dead. His voice sounded distorted in his own ears, as though it came from outside his skull. And beneath the distortion, he heard the call signs again. Faint, broken, but they're 2 check lead, 3 fuel state, bingo, 4, 4, 4. They weren't voices. They were recordings looping, replayed imperfectly. Reyes felt his gut twist. The scene wasn't just carrying them. It was playing them back. He caught sight of something ahead. No, not ahead, but through. The scene pulsed, light swelling, and for a split second he saw silhouettes again. 3 F-4s, frozen mid-flight, embedded in the line like fossils trapped in stone. The shapes wavered, dissolved into geometry, then snapped out of existence. Carter whimpered. "They're stuck. They're inside it." Reyes forced his voice steady. "They're not gone. They're still flying." But he didn't believe it. Not really. The cockpit delay worsened. Every motion felt like swimming through syrup. The gauges remained loyal to their false stability, but Reyes felt the truth in his bones. The horizon wasn't real. The sea wasn't sea. The sky wasn't sky. He was inside something else. Something designed to look like the world, until the seams began to show. The F. For Phantom was never meant to feel like a coffin, but by 22:35, Captain Elias Reyes felt the canopy closing on him like a lid. The seam of light cut the sky into halves and the world behind him. The carrier, the ocean, his formation, was gone as if erased with sponge. He was flying lead a flight of one, inside a sky that refused to behave. He told himself the others were there, just behind the veil, keeping pace. He told himself formations didn't unravel in silence. But the empty radios and the stillborn horizon said otherwise. Lieutenant Carter hadn't spoken for minutes. He hunched over the radar, tapping the scope with fingernail, as if physical contact might conjure echoes of their missing wingmen. Finally, he whispered, "Lead, they're gone." Reyes tightened his grip on the stick. "Negative. They broke comms, that's all." "No, sir. They didn't just break comms. They broke out." At 22:36, the whispering began again. This time it was louder, a tide swelling against the cockpit glass. Reyes recognized fragments, a call sign half-shaped, syllables torn like fabric in wind. "Viper 2, check left. 3 Talid. For bingo fuel, bingo fuel, Carter's hands trembled against the panel. It's them. Jesus, it's their voices. Reyes forced his tone flat. Recordings. Radio bleed. Nothing more. But deep down, he knew better. These weren't clean comms. They were echoes, fragments of moments that had already happened. A shimmer drew his eyes to the seam itself. For a heartbeat, he saw them. 3 phantoms, silhouettes suspended mid-flight, like insects trapped in amber. Their navigation strobes pulsed weakly, but not in sync. The rhythm was broken, stuttering like a failing heartbeat. 2, 3, 4. Reyes shouted into dead comms. Break right now. The silhouettes quivered. The strobes brightened, then bent, twisting into impossible angles. The aircraft fractured like glass struck by a hammer, shattering into shards of light that spun and dissolved. Carter made a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. They're not flying anymore. They're inside it. Reyes felt the words pierce through his calm like a blade. No, they're ahead of us. That's all. They're ahead. But even as he said it, the conviction drained. He could feel the empty space where they should have been, the absence not just of sight, but of presence. Flying formation wasn't visual alone. It was muscle memory, the weight of other aircraft in the air. And that weight was gone. The Phantom rode alone. At 22:39, the altimeter spun 30 feet down, then snapped back up. Fuel bled away in gulps. 19,000 pounds, then 18.5, then 18. Even though throttle and burn remained steady, the gauges weren't lying anymore. They were telling a truth Reyes didn't want. The world was consuming him piece by piece. Carter whispered, "We should turn back." Reyes ignored him. Turning back implied there was still a back to turn to. He felt only the pull forward, the way the seam widened slightly, beckoning like a runway at night. Then the canopy went dark. Not pitch black, but dull, as if someone had drawn curtains across the stars. Only the seam remained, bright and merciless. Reyes blinked, adjusted his helmet lamp, but the outside world stayed drained. No constellations, no horizon, no reflection on the sea below. Only the chalk-lined corridor threading infinity. "This isn't night anymore," Carter whispered. "This is something else." Reyes pressed his lips together until they hurt. He could not answer, because part of him agreed. At 22:42, another shimmer. For the briefest moment, the phantoms appeared again, closer this time, their wings distorted, tails stretched thin like shadows at sunset. Reyes swore he saw faces in the canopies, distorted and pale, but when he blinked, the images snapped away. He yanked the mic switch. 2, 3. For "You're with me, you hold formation." The radios crackled to life for 1 second. A scream tore through the net. Not words, not even human tone, but a raw frequency that rattled his helmet. Then silence. Carter ripped his headset off, eyes wide. What the hell was that? Reyes' throat burned. It was them. It had to be them. But he knew it wasn't them. It was the corridor, using their voices like puppets. The final break came at 22:45. The seam pulsed once, twice, and the silhouettes of the 3 phantoms stretched out like elastic, their forms unraveling into threads of light that wound upward and vanished in the dome of fractured stars. Carter slammed his fist against the dash. "They're gone! God damn it, they're gone!" Reyes stared into the empty sky until his eyes watered. The seam remained, straight and indifferent. His wingmen had been erased as cleanly as chalk from a board. He whispered to himself, not to Carter, not to the recorder, but to the dark. I was flying lead. They were my responsibility. The cockpit offered no reply. The gauges ticked in obedient rhythm. And the seam pulled him forward, the lone survivor of a patrol that had never been meant to return. By 22:47, Reyes had stopped trusting his eyes. The seam still ran ahead, cold and merciless, but everything else had grown unreliable. Stars shifting like broken projections, ocean frozen as glass, instruments ticking in 2 conflicting realities. His only tether left was his own voice. "Cockpit recorder is hot," he said aloud, partly for Carter's sake, mostly for his own. "I'm logging everything. Every damn second." Carter didn't argue. He just pressed his helmet back tighter against his head, eyes wide, pupils too large in the glow of the radar scope. Reyes saw his Rio's lips move in silent prayer. Viper 1, lead. Reyes said into the mic, even though the net was dead. Patrol lost comms at 2221. Entered anomalous corridor unknown origin. Attempting to maintain altitude 20,000, heading to 75. The cockpit voice recorder dutifully spun in its casing, tape threading across its reels, capturing everything. Reyes wanted the record. If he vanished like the others, someone had to hear what he had seen. At 2249, the scene brightened. Reyes narrated. Visual on corridor structure. Stars displaced. Ocean reflection locked. Horizon static. Echoes of wingmen, intermittent visual contact. Possible temporal displacement. Carter barked a laugh. Too sharp. Temporal displacement? Jesus, you're writing a science fiction report now. Better than leaving it blank. Reyes shot back. He felt the recorder's red light burning behind his shoulder. Every word was insurance. But as he spoke, a faint hiss grew under his voice. Not through the intercom. From the recorder itself. He glanced back. The reel spun. But the hiss was steady, low, like a detuned radio. At 2251, Carter gasped. Fuel's dropping fast. We're at 17 flat. That's impossible. Tell the tape that. Reyes keyed his mass mic again. Fuel anomaly recorded. Burn rate inconsistent. Suspect environmental interference. The hiss on the recorder grew louder. At 2253, the seam rippled. For a heartbeat, the cockpit lit with blue-white fire. Reyes and Carter both shouted, ducking instinctively as if it were lightning. The Phantom shuddered with a deep groan that made the panels flex. Then the light snapped away. Reyes forced his voice steady. Corridor is interacted with aircraft. Structure appears semi-permeable. Recommend. He froze. His voice wasn't his voice anymore. It played back to him, an echo with half a second's delay. Recommend. Carter's head whipped around. That's not us. That's the tape. The recorder reel spun. The hiss swallowed his words, replaying fragments out of sync, as though the machine itself had become part of the corridor. At 2255, Reyes made his last deliberate log of the night. Pilot's note. I don't know if this is reaching anyone. We lost 2, 3 for inside the corridor. I saw them break, scatter, dissolve. The recorder will show it. The recorder? The hiss surged, drowning him. Carter toward his harness straps. It's wiping us. Don't you get it? It's not recording us. It's overwriting us. Reyes slammed his glove on the recorder housing, the metal box rattling against its mount. The hiss didn't falter. The reel spun on, steady as heartbeat, swallowing everything. At 2257, the cockpit fell into absolute silence again. Not engine noise, though still purred, gauges still ticked, but human silence. Reyes and Carter sat frozen, breath fogging masks, unwilling to speak another word into a machine that was no longer theirs. Reyes reached out, switched the recorder off. The reel stopped. The hiss lingered another second, then died. The cockpit was a tomb again. Later, though he didn't know when, not until the tribunal played it back, Reyes would hear the tape. An hour-long reel. Not his voice. Not Carter's. Only static. A low, steady hiss, like a detuned radio, filling every second. No cockpit chatter. No instrument clicks. No stopwatch taps. Just the sound of erasure, clean and merciless, as though their flight had never existed at all. And that was when Reyes understood the corridor didn't just consume planes. It consumed proof. At 2341, Reyes broke cloud over Pacific. He didn't remember descending, didn't remember banking east, didn't remember calling approach. One instant the seam had been in front of him, bright and merciless, and the next the night sky had gone ordinary again. Cloud layers, faint stars, and the dull amber glow of the carrier's deck lights rising out of the black. Carter exhaled so hard it rattled his mask. Oh, God, we're back. We're back. But Reyes wasn't sure. The sea below looked too calm, too still, like it was waiting for confirmation. He flicked his eyes across the gauges. Fuel low but stable, engines humming, altimeter steady. Everything had returned to normal, but the normal felt counterfeit, like a replica built by someone who had only studied the real thing from a distance. Viper 1, Marshall. The radio crackled suddenly, alive again as if nothing had happened. Say state. Reyes gripped the mic. Throat dry. Marshall. Viper 1. 2 souls. Fuel 14,000. Angels 5. Inbound. The voice came back sharp and routine. Roger. Viper 1. Case 3 recovery. Marshall stack at 6,000. Expect approach in 3 minutes. Say position of remaining elements. Reyes swallowed. His lips refused to shape the words. Carter leaned into the mic. His voice was flat. Marshall, Viper 2, 3. And for a no longer in formation. The channel went dead for half second. Then, say again, Viper 1. Reyes forced it out. Lost visual at 2215. Lost comms. Attempted search. No contact. I repeat, 3 aircraft missing. The silence from Marshall was longer this time. When the voice returned, it carried none of the calm. Copy, Viper 1. Continue inbound. The carrier deck rose out of sea like a rectangle of salvation. The Fresnel lens blinked him in, meatballs sliding red to amber. Reyes rode the glide slope with hands steadier than he expected. The Phantom slammed into the deck at 2349. Hook catching third wire with a screech. Engines spooled down. The jet rattled to a halt. The moment the canopy cracked open, the deck crew froze. Reyes saw it in their faces. Their search for the other 3 planes, the reflexive head turning toward the horizon. Only one had returned. Yellow shirts signaled. Green shirts waved. But no one smiled. Carter ripped his helmet off as if it burned. His hair was plastered to his skull, sweat dripping down his jaw. He staggered down the ladder, boots hitting deck like dead weight. Reyes followed slower, legs trembling but posture rigid. He was led, after all. Led didn't stumble. Led didn't show his knees ready to collapse. On the non-skid, the smells hit him. Jet fuel, salt, paint, sweat. Normal. Ordinary. But too sharp, too saturated, as if the world was trying too hard to prove itself real. The squadron commander was waiting by the island, arms crossed. Commander Dalton was a hard man, face carved by salt air and sleepless watches. His eyes locked on Reyes, then flicked once to the empty night behind him. Where are my other birds, Captain? Dalton's voice was flat steel. Reyes snapped a parade rest, helmet tucked against his ribs. His throat felt full of sand. Lost comms. Lost visual. No radar returns. They disappeared inside an anomalous corridor. Dalton's jaw worked. He leaned closer, voice low. Don't you dare walk onto my deck talking nonsense. Reyes's hand shook, and he forced it still. Sir, I have a full tape. Cockpit recorder ran the entire sortie. It'll explain. Carter barked a laugh, ragged, hysterical. Static, sir. That's autoplay. Just static. Dalton's gaze moved from one to the other. His nostrils flared. You'd better pray you're wrong. They were escorted below before they could strip their flight gear. The narrow passageways of the carrier felt tighter than the cockpit had, bulkheads sweating with condensation, red lights bleeding across the steel. Sailors glanced up from hatches as they passed. No one asked. No one had to. Everyone knew 3 Phantoms had launched. Only one had returned. The ready room was silent when they entered. Dozens of eyes tracked Reyes and Carter. Some accusing, some afraid, none friendly. The empty chairs where Viper 2, 3, and 4 should have sat glare like wounds. Dalton followed them in, voice crisp. Sit down. Reyes lowered himself into a chair, his knees stiff, his helmet heavy in his lap. Carter collapsed into the seat beside him, staring at the deck with hollow eyes. Dalton stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. 3 aircraft don't vanish. 3 crews don't vanish. If you can't give me something concrete, Captain, you'll be grounded before you hit the rack. Reyes met his eyes. Sir, I saw them. They were pulled into the corridor. Their voices came back as echoes. Their aircraft broke apart in light. I logged everything. Dalton's lip curled. Then we'll see on the tape. Hours later, Reyes sat in a narrow compartment as a technician, loaded the cockpit voice recorder into a gray metal player. The reels turned. Speakers crackled. Static. 60 minutes of steady hiss, broken only by the faint clicks of background interference. No voices. No coordinates. No call signs. No screams. Just white noise, patient and merciless. Dalton stared at the player, without expression. Then he looked at Reyes. That's your proof. Reyes' stomach knotted. He tried to protest, tried to explain, but his throat wouldn't shape the words. The tape had cut him out of existence. Back on deck, sailors still looked toward the horizon long after midnight, waiting for strobes that would never return. Reyes lay in his rack, eyes open, hearing the hiss of the tape in his skull like the sound of the sea. He was alive. He had proof in his memory. But to the carrier, to the record, to the world, he had returned alone. The debriefing room smelled of coffee gone stale and varnish that had absorbed decades of sweat. It wasn't large, just a rectangular box bolted to the carrier's frame, furnished with a table, 3 chairs, and a tape recorder of the kind that promised permanence. The irony wasn't lost on Captain Elias Reyes. He had just survived an encounter with a machine that erased everything. Now he was about to be dissected by one that kept everything. At 2:10, the door shut behind him. Commander Dalton remained standing, arms folded across his chest, while 2 intelligence officers in starched khakis sat across the table. Neither gave names. One was older, hair clipped short and white at the temples. The other was younger, face bland, pen already ticking on a notepad. Between them, the tape recorder's reel spun lazily. Captain Reyes, the older one, began. His voice was precise, like a scalpel. Described the mission from takeoff. Reyes's throat worked. He spoke in sequence, keeping his tone flat, military. Launch, formation, climb. The corridor. The seam. The missing wingmen. Carter's fear. The echoes. The breaking of light. He even confessed to logging everything on the cockpit tape. When he reached the part about the playback, his voice broke. It was gone. Everything I said. Everything we saw. Just static. The younger officer scratched his pen, head down. The older officer leaned forward slightly. And yet you recall these events in detail. Yes, sir. Then you acknowledge it may be a perceptual event. Stress-induced hallucination. Shared delusion. Reyes's fist tightened on his knees under the table. With respect, sir, 3 aircraft don't hallucinate into thin air. The pen scratched again. Dalton shifted behind him, silent, unreadable. At 2:23, they began the repetition cycle. Altitude at initial anomaly, 20,000. Heading, 275. Time of first visual contact, 2121. Again, altitude at initial anomaly, 20,000. Heading, 275. Time of first visual contact. The same questions, over and over, until Reyes's jaw ached from clenching. It was less about his answers than about watching him repeat them, testing cracks, waiting for his memory to crumble. Carter was brought in at 2:40. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling as he folded into the chair beside Reyes. The same questions were fired at him. Altitude, heading, visuals, the corridor, the voices. Carter's answers aligned with Reyes's, but each time he added a note of despair, his voice hitching like a man already halfway broken. At one point he whispered, "I heard them screaming." The pen froze. The older officer's gaze sharpened. Screaming? Yes, sir. Not words. Just like the corridor used their lungs. Reyes stared at him. Carter hadn't said that in the cockpit. The officers exchanged a glance. Then the pen resumed its scratching. At 3:05, the tone shifted. The questions grew broader. "Captain, have you ever experienced disorientation in flight?" "No, sir." "Any prior incidents of vertigo, blackout, migraine?" "No, sir." "Nightmares?" Reyes's jaw worked. Yes, sir. Every pilot does. The younger officer's pen scratched harder, circling something unseen. Then the older one asked, almost gently, Captain Reyes, are you certain you returned with the same aircraft you launched in? The room fell still. Reyes felt his skin go cold. Yes, sir, he said finally. His voice cracked. Are you certain? Reyes's mouth was dry as sand. Yes. The pen noted something with deliberate slowness. At 3:30, Dalton finally spoke. His voice was low, gravel rough. That tape will go into the record as static. Nothing more. The official log will state a training mishap, weather interference, loss of comms, failure to rejoin. Reyes turned in his chair, fury flaring. Sir, 3 aircraft are gone. 12 men. That's not a mishap. Dalton's jaw flexed. Do you want the families to hear you talk about corridors in the sky? Geometry swallowing jets? Voices on the wind? Or do you want them to hear the Navy lost their boys in bad weather? Which story is survivable? Reyes couldn't answer. His throat was fire. The tape recorder clicked softly, reel spinning, capturing every silence. At 3:42, they were dismissed. Carter stumbled out first, shoulders hunched, eyes vacant. Reyes lingered by the door, helmet still clutched to his ribs. The older officer's voice stopped him. One more question, Captain. Off the record. Reyes turned, pulse hammering. The officer leaned back in his chair, pen motionless now. When you saw the light fracture your wingmen, did you ever wonder if it was letting you go on purpose? Reyes's breath caught. Dalton barked. That's enough. But the question lingered, heavy as the sea pressing against the carrier's hull. At 4 o'clock, Reyes lay in his rack, staring at the red glow of the bulkhead light. The ship hummed around him, engines throbbing like a pulse. He closed his eyes, but the officer's words repeated, circling like sharks. Why you? Why alive? The tape hissed in his dreams. The morning of March 12th broke with a steel-gray horizon and a sea that looked hammered flat by invisible hands. The carrier's deck bustled as usual, yellow shirts waving, engine spooling, ordnance crews checking racks. To anyone watching, it was routine. To Captain Elias Reyes, it felt staged. Every motion too precise, every sound too measured, as though the world was a rehearsal of itself. Dalton had grounded him after the debrief, but less than 24 hours later, orders reversed. A simple systems check flight. They called it 2 hours max. Nothing aggressive, nothing stressful. Just take a bird up, run through diagnostics, land. Reyes suspected the truth. They wanted to see if the madness traveled with him. At 9:12, he climbed into a Phantom fresh off maintenance. Carter wasn't with him this time. The seat behind remained empty. He should have felt lighter. Instead, the silence of the back seat pressed against him like a weight. The deck crew gave thumbs up. He taxied forward. Hook up, wings locked, nose was steering biting into the deck. Catapult tension built, and for a second Reyes considered raising his hand, signaling abort. But the idea of refusing was worse. It would brand him broken. The shooter crouched, pointed forward. Reyes braced. The Phantom roared down the cat, slammed free and clawed sky. For the first 15 minutes, everything worked by the book. Gauges in the green, engine smooth, hydraulics steady. He leveled at 20,000 feet, heading 275, the same vector as that night. His hands ached from how hard he gripped the stick. Marshal Viper 1, systems nominal, he called. His voice was steady enough. The response crackled back routine. Copy, Viper 1. Continue systems check. Reyes cycled gear, flaps, speed brakes. Each responded crisp. He toggled radar. Scope swept clean. A normal flight. A safe flight. But normal had become the most suspicious thing in the world. At 9:36, the fuel gauge twitched. Just once. From 13,000 pounds to 12,900, then back. A blip. Reyes frowned. Say again, fuel? He tapped the dial with a gloved finger. It dropped again. 12,900, 12,800, 12,700. Throttle steady. Burn unchanged. No leaks. no trails streaming from the wings. Yet the gauge ticked down like an invisible siphon had opened. Reyes's mouth went dry. Marshall, Viper 1, experiencing fuel anomaly. Burn rate, not matching throttle setting. The pause on the radio was longer than routine allowed. Then, copy Viper 1. State present fuel. 12.5 and falling. Roger. Continue to monitor. Continue to monitor, as if he had a choice. By 9:42, the other gauges began to stutter. Altimeter flickered 50 feet up, then down. Vertical velocity needle twitched with no corresponding movement. Even the clock on the panel hesitated, its second hand jerking forward, then back. Reyes's chest tightened. He'd seen this before. The corridor wasn't out there. It was in here. At 9:45, the first shimmer appeared. Not ahead, not in the horizon seam, but inside the canopy glass itself. Light bled along the edges like frost spreading across a window. Reyes flinched back, heart pounding. "No," he whispered. "Not again." But the shimmer pulsed, faint blue-white, geometric, the same impossible geometry that had taken his wingmen. He switched his mic live. "Marshall, Viper 1 declare an emergency. Fuel at 11 flat, instruments unreliable, visual anomaly inside cockpit." The radio hissed. "Marshall, say again?" "Nothing. Only static, patient and merciless." Reyes yanked the recorder switch. Desperation overriding fear. Cockpit log active. Viper 1 experiencing recurrence of anomalous corridor effects. Fuel bleed, instrument drift, canopy shimmer. Altitude 20,000, heading 275. Request. The recorder hissed. Static. Reyes slammed it off with a snarl. At 9:49, the shimmer receded, peeling back from the canopy like dew evaporating. Gauges steadied. Fuel settled at 10.8. The world snapped ordinary again, clouds and ocean and sky. The radio returned, casual as routine. "Viper 1, say status." Reyes's hands trembled on the stick. He forced his voice flat. "System stabilized. Fuel 10.8. Returning to base." The reply came crisp. "Copy, Viper 1. Recover case I." As if nothing had happened. He trapped aboard at 10:12. Catching second wire, engine screaming, hook clattering. The deck crew swarmed, their expressions taut. Dalton was waiting again. Reyes climbed down the ladder, helmet under his arm, and said nothing. Dalton's eyes narrowed. "How much this time?" Reyes swallowed. "Enough." Dalton didn't ask more. He didn't have to. The answer was already clear in the look on Reyes's face. Whatever had taken 3 phantoms into the corridor wasn't gone. It had come back with him. The carrier at night was a living machine. Fans thrummed in bulkheads. Pumps beat like slow hearts. Steam lines hissed behind painted steel. Reyes had always found comfort in that mechanical lullaby. It meant the ship was awake, alert, carrying them all through the black. After the second flight, it felt like camouflage, noise to hide something else breathing with them. He didn't sleep. Not really. He lay in his rack staring at the thin red glow of the overhead lamp, listening to the ship, waiting for the other sound. Somewhere around 2 o'clock, it arrived. "Lead, check lead." He jerked up so fast his head struck the underside of the rack above. The voice was faint, filtered, like someone whispering through 2 steel doors. Not the corridor's low oceanic hum, not the recorder's indifferent hiss. A voice, shaped and human, wearing the exact cadence of flight comms. He held his breath. "Viper 2, Viper 2, lead you?" Silence clamped down. The ship's pumps swelled back in. Across the berthing compartment, a sailor snored. Reyes swung his feet to the deck, laced his boots with shaking hands, and walked. The passageways were at half-light. Red bulbs turned down to preserve night vision. He padded past sleeping compartments, past a wardroom, past a ladder well that breathed warm air. No one challenged him. Officers wandering insomniac wasn't a rare sight. He found himself outside the ready room and stopped with his hand on the latch. Through the door, he could already hear it, the low, rapid murmur of comms. But the room was dark, projector dead, no briefing underway. The speakers on the bulkhead were off. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once. He eased the door open. Empty chairs. Coffee rings on the long table. A whiteboard with today's deck cycle smudge half erased. Reyes stood in the threshold and listened. 3, tally on lead, tally on. Then a high, thin squeal cut across the room, like someone dragging a fork across a plate. Reyes's teeth ached. The squeal sharpened into familiar beep of an IFF interrogator. Wrong tone, wrong era, like museum piece scratching for attention. He took one step inside. Silence felt like a trap. He stood absolutely still, lungs tight, waiting for the sound to return and trying not to wish for it. When none came, he backed out and let the door click shut. At 3:20, he was in the hangar deck, among sleeping jets with their noses canted, engines blanketed, ladders up. Crews moved like ghosts, carrying toolboxes, murmuring in low voices. He climbed a ladder into a cold phantom and sat in the front seat, hands on his knees. The cockpit smelled of insulation, hydraulic fluid. The faint sour ghost of fear left by 100 flights. He closed his eyes. The headset, hanging from the canopy rail, brushed his shoulder. He slid it on. Dead net. Static. Then past the static. Soft as fog. Bingo, fuel. Bingo. 2, he whispered, forgetting there was no transmit. 2, say again. Say again. Nothing. The static thickened, a veil lowering. And then even that faded until Reyes heard only his own breath in the cups. He ripped the headset off and hurled it into the footwell. It thumped against aluminum and fell still. He sat there a long time. By dawn, the ocean had turned to hammered pewter. Low swell slapping the hull. Reyes dragged himself to the wardroom and poured coffee that tasted like warm pennies. The squadron filtered in with the brittle gossip of men naming the day's tasks to avoid naming yesterday's losses. No one spoke to him until Lieutenant Carver, one of Dalton's senior section leads, set a tray across from him and sat. "You look like you fought the ship and lost," Carver said mildly. He was older than Reyes by a decade and had the unflappable air of a man who'd outlasted 3 COs and 2 marriages. Reyes stared into his coffee. "Did you hear anything last night? On the pipes? On the speakers?" Carver buttered his toast with the care of a surgeon. "Like what?" "Comms," Reyes said. "Flight net. Call signs." Carver chewed. Swallowed. "No," he sipped his tea. "But I heard you walking laps." Everyone did. Reyes's cheeks burned. He had the sudden childish urge to defend himself. "I wasn't afraid." He kept his mouth shut. Carver watched him a moment longer, then reached for the salt. "I heard them," Reyes said, voice low. 2, 3, 4. I heard them. Carver set the salt down without using it. "Say it here and I won't repeat it. Say it in the passageway and it becomes someone else's idea of you." He leaned forward. "What do they say?" "Fragments. Check-ins. Bingo calls. Like the corridors planned them back. Like it kept the parts of them that sounded like duty." Carver's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes tightened. "I think," he said slowly, "you should get some sleep." Reyes laughed without humor. "Sleep brings more of it." Carver stood, gathered his tray. "Then stay awake until you can't. That's how we do it." He paused. "And Reyes, don't go looking for ghosts in the jets." The warning stung because it landed on truth. After Carver left, Reyes poured his coffee down the scullery sink and watched it swirl into the ship's throat. By mid-morning, the day had turned practical. Paperwork, systems reports, a perfunctory visit to the flight surgeon, who peered into Reyes's pupils and asked whether he'd seen flashes of light. Only when the world ended, Doc, and a mandated nap he lay through without closing his eyes. He told no one about the ready room, or the hangar, or the whisper that had climbed into his rack like a draft. At 1400 hours, Dalton called him to the tiny office carved out of the space between ductwork and steel. The CO looked as though he hadn't slept either. A folder lay on his desk. He didn't offer Reyes a seat. "You're off the schedule for 48 hours, Dalton said. "That's an order, not a kindness. You will not step into a cockpit. You will not set foot on the hangar deck. You will not wander the passageways like a ghost. You will sleep, eat, and present yourself to medical when told. Understood. Yes, sir. Good. Dalton tapped the folder once. Intel wants another round with you tonight. In the meantime, if anyone asks what you heard last night, you say nothing. Reyes held his gaze. And if I heard my wingmen? Dalton's jaw flexed. For a second, Reyes saw something raw flicker there. Regret, maybe, or envy. You heard the ship, Dalton said. That's all any of us ever hear at night. Back in berthing. Reyes lay down because he'd been ordered to. The shipsum climbed over him like a blanket. For an hour, maybe two, he drifted just outside sleep, where thoughts have edges but no weight. The whisper found him there. Lead. He sat up, eyes wide in the dim. The sound wasn't outside now. It wasn't in the walls, or the pipes, or the dead speakers. It was inside his jaw, in the hinge where bone meets ear, a vibration that bypassed air. Lead. Say state. 2, he breathed. The word fogged the cold air in front of his face, and he hated the prayer in it. Silence. Then, very faintly, a new voice. Slower. Measured. Viper 3. Fuel state unknown. Angels unknown. Reyes pressed his palms to his ears. The voices did not dim. They weren't coming from a world. They were coming from him. He went to the sink, turned the cold tap until it roared, splashed water on his face until his skin stung. The metal mirror above the basin showed a man with salt dried at the corners of his eyes, stubble too dark against pale skin, a jaw clenched hard enough to crack a tooth. He gripped the edge of the sink and waited for the voices to recede. They did, for 5 minutes. At 1900 hours, in the mess line, they rose again. For 4-4, a stuck transmission, a metronome tapping the number that meant last in the stack, youngest, most likely to crack jokes in the brief. Reyes's tray shook in his hands. The sailor behind him swore as milk slopped over. Reyes muttered an apology and fled with a roll and a cup of coffee he wouldn't drink. He ate in an alcove no one used, back against a bulkhead that vibrated with the ship's pulse. The voices faded to the edge of hearing, as if respecting the bounds of food. He chewed each bite as if it were an oath. At 21:30, Intel took him again. Same room, same tape machine, different officers. They asked about his sleep, his diet, his mental weather. He answered like a man reading altitudes, numbers, facts. When they asked whether he'd heard anything unusual aboard, he lied with the ease of a pilot calling fuel good when it isn't. Dalton had told him the shape of the truth he was allowed to have. By 23:10, he was back in his rack, staring at the red light. He had the thought, absurd and heavy, that if he could keep his eyes open all the way to dawn, the voices would have to admit defeat. He focused on the ship, its hum, its churn, its rattles. The whisper rose through it like a flautist finding a note under an orchestra. Lead. Turn to heading 275. He didn't breathe. The words were clean, the cadence identical to his own voice on a clear night. Not 2, not 3, not 4. His own voice fed back to him. He slid his feet to the deck and stood, the way men stand in church when they know they will speak. The passageway outside was empty. Somewhere far forward, a bosun's pipe trilled and died. "Say again," he whispered, ridiculous, alone, silence. Then, not a voice but a sensation, like a gentle hand at the small of his back, turning him toward a direction that had no meaning aboard ship. He felt the way a man feels north in his bones. 275, the vector he'd flown into the seam. Reyes leaned his forehead against the cool steel of the bulkhead and laughed once, a short, cracked sound. "If you're here," he said softly, not caring whether he meant the corridor or the men it had taken, "then stop whispering and say what you want." No answer came, only the ship breathing. He slept finally right there against the steel, because exhaustion is an order the body can't refuse. He dreamed of the runway at Miramar on a hot August day, heat shivering off the tarmac, a tower voice counting down vectors. In the dream, when he looked up, the sky above the runway was a seam of white light, and the controller said, "Lead, the road is open." He woke before dawn, heart roaring, mouth dry, palms damp. The ship had not moved an inch. The sea didn't care. The voices were quiet. Reyes dressed slowly and walked topside into gray before sunrise. The deck was slick with dew. The wind smelled of salt and kerosene. He went to the edge, looked out along the bearing he knew by muscle and prayer, and watched the horizon. It behaved. For now, somewhere, deep in the bone hinge of his jaw, a memory of a voice folded itself small and waited. The summons came at 1400 hours, delivered by a yeoman with eyes fixed somewhere over Reyes' shoulder. No explanation. Just, Colonel needs you. The office wasn't on the carrier's standard deck plan. It had been carved out of the space forward, tucked between comms and radar maintenance. Its bulkheads freshly painted in a sterile off-white. A flag stood in one corner, the stars and stripes, crisp and new. Behind the desk, medals gleamed in a glass case, not earned aboard this ship, but imported, staged, arranged for effect. The colonel sat waiting, a tall man with shoulders that seemed too broad for his chair, hair gray but clipped with parade precision. His face was unreadable, except for the eyes, which carried the faint disgust of a man forced to handle something beneath him. "Captain Reyes," he said. His voice was calm, slow, honed by years of courtroom briefings and command conferences. "Sit." Reyes obeyed. The chair creaked beneath him. He kept his helmet in his lap, fingers pressed into the rim. The colonel tapped a folder on the desk. On its cover, in red block letters, "Confidential." "You've flown 3 times since launch night," the colonel said. "The first ended with 3 aircraft missing. The second, your systems misbehaved. The third, you grounded yourself because of, what was the term, auditory anomalies." Reyes' jaw tightened. "Yes, sir." The colonel leaned forward. "I have the tape of your debrief. I have the static. I have your squadron commander's notes. But I don't have one thing I can present to Washington. Do you know what that is, Captain?" Reyes stayed silent. "Control," the colonel said. His tone was matter-of-fact, almost weary. "I don't have control, and that makes men in my position very nervous." The colonel opened the folder. Inside lay a single sheet. Not radar plots. Not fuel logs. A statement already typed, already signed by someone higher. He rotated it slowly so Reyes could see. It read, "On the night of March 11, 1972, 4 F-4 Phantom aircraft launched from USS Hancock for a scheduled patrol. 1 aircraft returned due to inclement weather and loss of communications. 3 failed to return. No evidence of hostile engagement was recorded. The paper was pristine, edges sharp. Final." Reyes stared at it. "That's a lie." The colonel's smile was faint, practiced. "It's the truth we're offering. My men dissolved in front of me. They didn't vanish into a thunderhead. They were taken." The colonel's smile vanished. His hand slapped the folder closed with a crack that made Reyes flinch. "You will not use that word in my presence. Taken. You understand? Aircraft crash. Aircraft burn. Aircraft disappear into the sea. But nothing is taken." Reyes' throat burned. He forced himself upright. "With respect, sir, you weren't there." "No," the colonel said softly. "And that's your misfortune. If I'd been there, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be attending funerals already signed and sealed." He stood, pacing to the flag in the corner, hand brushing its fabric as though drawing strength. "You're a good pilot. Your record proves that. But you're not indispensable. Pilots come and go. Files remain." He turned back, eyes sharp. "Do you want to remain a file, Captain? A cautionary tale whispered in ready rooms? Or do you want to remain a pilot?" Reyes felt heat rise behind his eyes. "I want the truth recorded." The colonel stepped closer, leaned down so his shadow fell across Reyes. "The truth is whatever protects the service, the ship, the country. Your men will be remembered as lost in weather. Their families will grieve, receive folded flags, and carry on. If you insist on a different story, you will be remembered as unstable, and you'll never fly again." The silence between them was heavy, humming with the carrier's bones. Reyes realized then that the colonel wasn't asking for his account. He was demanding his surrender. "I can't sign that," Reyes whispered. The colonel's expression didn't flicker. "Then don't. Your commander will sign it for you. But understand this. The more you resist, the more you invite scrutiny. And scrutiny will not end with you. It will touch your family, your wife, your child. Do you want that? Reyes' heart clenched. He thought of his daughter's small hand gripping his thumb, the way she'd once pointed at the night sky and asked which stars were his. The colonel watched the struggle on his face and nodded once. Good. Then you understand. At 15:05, the session ended. Reyes left the office feeling smaller than when he'd entered, helmet heavy, the flag's color still burning in his eyes. The corridor outside smelled of oil and steel, but beneath it, he swore he smelled the faint ozone tang of the corridor itself. Sailors passed him without glance. To them, he was just another officer walking the ship. But inside, Reyes felt branded, marked by something both the colonel and the scene in the sky understood. He was no longer the master of his own story. That night, back in his rack, the voices returned. Fainter this time, as if testing. Lead, state, fuel. Reyes clenched his eyes shut. For the first time, he didn't answer. He wasn't sure whether that was loyalty or surrender. The ship kept perfect time. Clocks and passageways ticked the same seconds. The flight schedule flipped at the same hours. Coffee pots burned at the same rate down to tar. Reyes envied the certainty. He had not trusted time since the corridor folded a minute out his cockpit clock and handed him back a lie. He started hoarding minutes anyway. At 23:30, he signed out a portable tape deck from comms for language practice. The yeoman smiled at the absurdity and stamped the chit without comment. He borrowed a second deck from AV for training review. He had his own microcassette from a long-ago ground school, the one he'd kept because he liked the click it made when he flipped aside in the dark. 3 machines, 3 different tape brands. 3 excuses to himself that redundancy meant safety. In his stateroom, if a space barely larger than 2 racks and a locker could be called that, he cleared the desk. The surface rattled gently with the ship's pulse. He lined the machines up, set 3 fresh reels on their spindles, fed leaders, wound tension with the care of surgeon. A pad of yellow paper sat beside them. He uncapped a pen and wrote at the top, in block letters, Control. The word didn't help. He pressed record on all 3 decks. The red eyes glowed. Test 1, he said, voice steady. Captain Elias Reyes, USS Hancock, March 12. Subject: anomalies observed on flights of March 11 and 12. Environment: quiet compartment, no comms, door secured. His voice sounded absurdly formal in the small room, like a man reporting a crime while standing next to body. He spoke for 10 minutes, then stopped and rewound each deck separately. He listened through twice, switching headphones from one machine to another, so quickly the pad squeaked. On all 3 tapes, his own words came back intact, unremarkable. No hiss beyond the machine's natural breath. No erasure. No corridor creeping down the wire. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Maybe it stayed in the air. Maybe it needed radios and radar and altitude to find him. Maybe. He tilted the desk lamp away and switched off the overhead red. Darkness pressed in, thick as a blanket. He restarted all 3 decks and spoke again, lower now, just above whisper. Test 2, detail by detail. He built the flight from muscle memory. The feel of catapult tension through his spine. The shove as the jet took sky. The way Carter had breathed through his nose when he was concentrating. A tiny sawtooth sound. The first moment he'd understood the horizon was lying. He described the scene without adjectives. The way instructors had taught him to talk a trainee through a blind approach. Facts, headings, times. He described the dissolving of his wingmen in the smallest language he could find. When he finished, his hands shook. He rewound tape A, press play. His voice returned obediently. A man trying to be the kind of witness a court would trust. He switched to tape B. Same. Tape C, same. He stared at the decks, waiting for the trick, for the instant the corridor would hear him describing it and reach out with the same soft, inevitable hand and rub him off the magnetic iron like chalk. Static did not rise. The machines did not betray him. He laughed, quiet, breath through his nose, more relief than joy. At 0:40, he tried the 3rd test. He clicked all 3 decks on, but said nothing. He waited. The reels turned, pulling silence into themselves. He wanted to catch it trying to speak first. He wanted to prove that the whisper in his jaw was a thing the world could catch in pen and label. After 7 minutes, a sound rose on tape B. He heard it only because the mark he'd made on the reel with a greased pencil slid past the capstan at the same time each rotation, and he'd learned the rhythm. A faint undulation under the machine's own susurrus. Not voice. Pattern. A cadence slower than breathing, faster than a heart. He froze, leaned in, pressed the cups of the headphones so hard against his skull his ears hurt. The sound faded, came back, faded again. He flipped the tape, ran it again. Nothing. He spun back. The cadence was gone as if he'd dreamed it. He set tape B aside and reached for the pad. Wrote 047 subsonic cadence, B only, fleeting. Then, without thinking, drew a short stack of parallel lines in a diagonal slash. How Carter had once sketched a radar sweep. He stared at the marks, then turned the pad face down. He recorded the fourth test like a confession. "If you can hear this," he said into the dark, not sure whether he meant the corridor or the colonel or God, "I know you're using the parts of us that sounded like duty. I know you want headings, altitudes, check-ins. You can keep those. I will keep the names." He said the names of his missing wingmen. Full names, middle initials, hometowns, the way they laughed, the way they threw a ball of masking tape at a junior Met's hand just to watch him juggle it. He said their wives' first names. He said the color of a baby blanket he'd helped fold in a squadron office, once while a new father took a call. He said the exact temperature of coffee on a cold pre-dawn launch. He said everything human he could think to say. When he rewound tape A, his own voice came back, thinner now, strained where it carried weight. On tape B, the cadence returned for 3 seconds in the middle of Bobby Talley from Amarillo, as if something had pricked up its ears at a syllable and then lost interest. Tape C played clean all the way through. He didn't write anything. He rewound them all to the start and left them spinning, without input. The desk vibrated very gently under his forearms. The ship's bones ticked. The red eye of each machine stared back like a watcher. At 1:15, a knock. Not on his door, on the bulkhead behind his rack. Light, twice. He stiffened. The ship was full of such noises. Steel moved, cooled, spoke. Still, he said, yeah, without meaning to. Nothing. He smiled at himself, small and embarrassed. He was about to turn the lamp back on, when the first voice entered the room. Not through the door, not through the air. Through the tape, led. He hit stop by reflex. The reels coasted down. Silence. He hit play. The reels climbed back to speed with their comforting whir. His own voice, test 1. Captain Elias Reyes. Filled the headphones for a bar, and then slid sideways as if the head had misaligned. The hiss deepened. A whisper shaped itself within it, building out of its harmonics the way surf can trick you into hearing your name. Let you copy? He snatched the headphones off. The room was immediately too bright with the tiny lamp, too warm with his breath. He pressed the pads back on and cupped them like a man drowning cups his ears against a storm. "Two," he said, ridiculous into nothing. Static. The reels turned. He leaned forward until his forehead touched the deck edge. Lead, state. He pulled the plug on the headphones so hard the jack squealed. Sound rushed into the room from the tiny built-in speaker. His own earlier narration, the tap of his pen, the little cough he hadn't noticed he'd made, and under it, almost too low to distinguish, the corridor's memory of duty. His mouth had gone dry. "You don't get to use that," he said softly to the machines. "You don't get to use them." He stopped the decks again. He labeled each tape in block letters, hand steadier now by force. Narrative/clean, B. Noise/cadence, C. Control/clean. He slid them into plastic cases, stacked them in the drawer, closed it, locked it. The key felt like a child's toy. He lay back on his rack, boots still on, and stared at the red lamp. He thought of the colonel's eyes and the way they had weighed him like cargo. He thought of Dalton's one-syllable orders. He thought of Carver buttering toast, as if it were a survival skill. He thought of Carter's hands shaking on the dash and how the kid had said lungs. He slept because bodies do. He dreamed he was back in the ready room alone. The projector was on, showing nothing but white. The tape machine clicked. He walked to the lectern and pressed play and heard the corridor speak in a voice made of all the voices he'd ever flown with, filtered through an ocean mile of steel. "Lead, you'll file the story we give you." When he woke, there was a taste of oxide on his tongue and a line of ink down his palm from where the pen had leaked. His desk lamp was still on. The machines were still. His pad lay open to a page filled edge to edge with slashes and parallel lines stacked into ladders. He did not remember drawing them. He turned the page and wrote, carefully, the only sentence that felt like an anchor. "If the corridor wants only the duty in us, I will give it the rest." He tore that page out, folded it twice, and slid it into his flight suit's inner pocket. The paper square against his ribs was a small, absurd comfort. At 6:30, reveille blared. He showered and watered the temperature of resignation and dressed by habit. Before he left the compartment, he unlocked the drawer and took tape B, the one that had briefly breathed. He tucked it next to the folded page. When he stepped into the passageway, the ship's breath washed over him. Men moved in the automatic ballet of 1,000 mornings. He moved with them, another piece in the pocket of machinery. As he passed a junction, a PA speaker crackled and died, then crackled again as if someone had almost said his name. He didn't stop. He didn't turn. The tape in his pocket was heavy as proof and light as a lie. Behind him, in a compartment, the two clean decks sat quiet. Their reels held his voice, neat and useful, ready for any officer with a key to hear and weigh and stamp. They could have the parts that sounded like duty. He carried the rest against his heart, where machines and men with folders could not erase it without burning the ship. The ready room had always been a noisy place. Even on the worst days, pilots filled it with mockery, gripes, clattering coffee mugs, the shorthand of men who trusted each other with their lives. On March 13th at 7:45, it was quiet enough to hear the fluorescent lights hum. Reyes entered with his helmet tucked against his ribs, uniform pressed as if discipline could hold his bones together. The room smelled of burnt coffee and jet fuel ground into carpet, but even those scents seemed muted, like a photograph fading in the sun. 3 pilots sat at the long table. Lieutenant Carver, steady as a lighthouse. Ensign Lyle, youngest of the squadron, knuckles white on his pen. Commander Dalton stood at the far end, not presiding so much as looming. They were all filling out forms. Flight logs, fuel tallies, the paperwork that pretended to transform chaos into order. Reyes slid into a chair. No one looked up. The absence of eye contact was louder than any accusation. The logs waited for him. Standard Navy forms with lines for time of launch, recovery, fuel state, remarks. He read the header 3 times before picking up his pen. His hand hovered. The truth pressed at his teeth. Launch 4. Return 1. Corridor took the rest. His pen touched paper. He wrote, launch, 21:14. Recovery, 23:49. Weather interference. Lost comms. Remaining section failed to rejoin. The words felt like gravel. Beside him, Lyle scribbled with frantic energy, the scratch of his pen harsh. Carver wrote in measured strokes, each line like a verdict. Dalton watched without comment, arms folded, his silence command all its own. At 7:58, the door opened. Carter entered, pale, eyes sunken. He hadn't been seen since the second interrogation. His flight suit hung on him as if he'd forgotten how to wear it. He sat heavily, pulled a form toward him, and stared at it as though it were written in a foreign language. No one welcomed him back. No one asked. After a long pause, he wrote one word in the remarks section, lost. Then he set his pen down and folded his hands. Reyes glanced at him, desperate for eye contact, for acknowledgement that they had shared the same nightmare. Carter's gaze stayed locked on the table. At 8:10, Dalton cleared his throat. The sound startled them all. "You'll log it as weather," he said flatly. "You'll log it as interference." Nothing else happened out there. Carver nodded once, a soldier accepting an execution order. Lyle swallowed hard but said nothing. Carter's fingers twitched against the tabletop, but he didn't speak. Reyes forced his voice past the lump in his throat. "Sir, with respect." Dalton cut him off. Respect is filing the story that keeps this squadron flying. Respect is not leaving a stain on 12 men's names their families will never wash out. His eyes pinned Reyes. Do you understand? Reyes didn't answer. The silence stretched until Dalton said it for him. Good. The logs became their ritual. Each man bent over paper, pens scratching like locusts. The only sound was the hum of the lights and the occasional shuffle of boots on carpet. Reyes signed his name with a hand that shook more than he wanted. When the stack of forms was collected, Dalton tucked them under his arm. He paused at the door. This is the last time we'll speak of it. The door closed behind him with the finality of a sealed hatch. At 8:35, the room emptied. Carver clapped Lyle's shoulder once, a gesture so forced it might have been carved from wood. Carter left without a word, shoulders hunched as if the ship itself pressed down on him. Reyes remained alone, staring at the blank table where his friend's signatures should have been. The silence in the ready room was no longer absence of sound. It was a packed, binding and heavy, a silence chosen. Reyes understood then that he was alone in more ways than one. Alone in the cockpit, alone in memory, alone even among men who had once trusted him with their lives. The corridor had taken 3 aircraft. The Navy had taken the rest. That night, Reyes tried to pray. He knelt by his rack, whispering words half-remembered from childhood, asking for clarity, for strength. The ship's hum answered with indifference. And beneath it, faint and patient, the voices returned. Led, log complete, log complete. Reyes pressed his hands to his ears until sleep claimed him. The locker room had always smelled like bleach and hot metal, a clean stink that stuck to your clothes no matter how quickly you showered. Reyes pushed through the swinging door at 2310 and found it empty. No towels slung over benches, no boots half-kicked under lockers, no laughter thick with salt and bravado. The fluorescents hummed overhead, the kind of hum you only hear when you're alone. Tiles gleamed, faucets dripped. The room looked staged, like a photograph of a locker room. He set his kit on the bench and stood in front of the mirror over the sinks. The glass was the imperfect kind you got in ships, waves frozen into it by heat and stress. It made the world look like it was thinking too hard. A stranger looked back, stubble too dark against drawn skin, eyes threaded with red, like cracked glaze, enough salt crusted in the creases to suggest he'd been standing out in a squall. He lifted his hand and watched the hand in the mirror lift a beat late. He froze, lifted again. The echo shortened but didn't vanish, like it was trying to catch up. He opened the cold tap. Water came out in a thin, steady stream. When he cupped it into his palms and splashed his face, the man in the mirror did the same, but the splash lagged by a fraction, drops breaking in different trajectories. He pressed his palms flat to the sink, leaned in until his breath fogged the glass. The fog moved on the other side of tempo off, tracing shapes that shouldn't exist in breath. Lines formed in the fog, thin, bright, straight. First one, then a second parallel to it. A third bisecting both at an angle too clean to be accidental. He wiped the sleeve across the glass. The lines vanished. He waited. They came back where his sleeve hadn't touched, patient, geometric. He killed the tap, silence falling with it. The fluorescence hummed. Somewhere a drain ticked as water found its way through a trap. He counted to 10, each number a rung on a ladder back to sober reality, and then raised his hand again. The mirror raised his hand with him this time, perfectly in sync, as if chastened. He let out a breath like a laugh that had changed its mind. He flipped the light switch off. Dark rolled over the room. Not complete, just the kind you get under shipboard red. His outline remained in the glass, a dark cutout against darker. He turned the light back on. The outline remained for half a heartbeat, then snapped into the current image. A jitter like a film splice. His stomach rolled. You're tired, he told himself. You're seeing what you're primed to see. The door hinges creaked somewhere behind him. He turned. No one stood there. The far bench held only the ghost of an indentation where a flight bag had sat that morning. He was already halfway back to the mirror before he admitted he'd wanted to see Carter there, wanting to say something razor-dumb to break the spell. He stared at his eyes. If he could hold his own gaze steady, maybe the world would relent. Instead, The world leaned closer. The tile behind his reflection softened, like heat mirage. The grout lines arched into curves, then straightened again. A faint blue-white luminance teased the edges of things. The stainless lip of the sink, the corner of a locker, the rim of the mirror frame. Just enough to make him think of the seam, never enough to let him accuse it out loud. He felt the old pressure in his ears, the feeling of descending too fast without equalizing. He swallowed. His jaw clicked. The whisper arrived without sound. He felt it as vibration in the hinge where jaw meets skull. A tone first, low, steady, almost kind. Then structure gathered around it like foam around a breaker. Syllables knitting themselves from harmonics. Lead. He closed his eyes. Opened them again. In the mirror, his mouth had not moved, but the breath fog on the glass shifted into a small, oval right where a mouth would open. "Two," he said. It made him feel cowed and foolish and desperate all at once. "Fuel, state?" The voice thinned and died. He grabbed the sink and squeezed until the veins stood in his forearms. The porcelain was real. The cold water puddled under his thumbs was real. He forced his head down and stared at the pooled reflection there, the upside-down man with the upside-down eyes. The little eddies drew shapes. 2 lines, a slash, the first marks of a radar scope sketched by a bored hand during a brief. He turned off the light again. Let the room be only red and hum and his own breathing. The mirror now reflected mostly absence, and absence his mind supplied the rest. The lattice came easily in the dark. Straight lines braided into spirals, spirals folding into curves that refused Euclid. Not an image so much as the idea of an image, a rule set written in bone. He blinked fast and hard until the afterimage went grainy and broke. He flicked the lights back on. The fluorescence stuttered, then came up steady. For a split blink, the man in the glass didn't come with them. There was only the room, empty as if he'd stepped away. Then he snapped into place with a flat present that made his skin gooseflesh. He rubbed his jaw until pain spoke louder than fear. Someone entered. The door swung, and a gust of colder air made the hairs on Reyes's forearms lift. Lieutenant Carver's reflection appeared over his shoulder, small and distant in the mirror. Carver moved as if gravity were set higher for him than for other men, deliberate, measured. He took the sink beside Reyes's, ran water, washed his hands with a tension that made the ordinary feel ceremonial. "You look like hell," Carver said to the mirror, not to Reyes. "I've seen better days," Reyes said. He hated how thin his voice sounded in tile. Carver dried his hands, folded the paper towel into a neat square, then unfolded it. Busy hands. "You sleep?" "Enough." "Lie." Carver nodded to a man who had also lied and didn't want help. He turned to go, then paused. "I saw Dalton reading your new tapes." Reyes went very still. "And they're clean." Carver let the paper towel fall into the bin. Story stays simple. Reyes's throat tightened. "Does it?" It wasn't a question. Carver didn't look at him. He studied his own face as if it belonged to a pilot he might have to ground. "If there's anything you want to know, you should tell me now." Before I forget, I asked. Reyes met his own eyes and said, "I see the corridor when I close my eyes. I see it when I open them. Sometimes I think it wants me to look back." Carver didn't flinch. "Then don't." He stepped away. At the door, he added without turning, "Mirrors lie, Captain. That's why barbers angle them. They make you look the way you think you look." The door swung. "Don't take briefings from glass." When he was gone, the locker room seemed larger. The fluorescence buzzed with mosquito persistence. Reyes leaned closer to the mirror until the world outside the frame blurred. His own pupils were too wide in the hard light. He lifted a hand. The mirror lifted with him perfectly obedient. He exhaled. Breath fogged the glass, bunched, and this time either because he wished it or because the world indulged him, drew a tiny square right over his breastbone in the reflection, the exact size and placement of the folded page he'd tucked under his flight suit zip. His heart misfired once. He unzipped and pulled the paper out, unfolded it. 3 creases, 2 smudges where his thumb had pressed the ink. He read the line he had written the night before as if someone else's hand had done it. "If the corridor wants only the duty in us, I will give it the rest." He pressed the paper flat against a mirror beside his face. The glass seemed to accept it and refuse it at once. For a second the words doubled in reflection, one set true, one set microscopically late. He left it there. Stupid, maybe, but he wanted to see whether it would be the thing that lagged next. He rinsed his face again, the shock of colder discipline. When he looked up, the paper was gone. Not off the mirror. Its physical sheet still clung to the glass with a wet edge. The reflection was gone. The mirror showed him alone. No paper pinned beside his cheek. No black letters to anchor the eye. He snatched the sheet away. The reflection returned, as if he'd moved it back into the rules. He let out a breath too loud for the room and laughed once without humor. He stuffed the page into his pocket and pressed it there as if pressure could force the world to honor it. He turned away from the mirror and sat on the bench to lace his boots. His fingers miscounted the eyelets. Twice he had to undo and start again. The ship's slow, omnipresent sway knocked his sense of center. When he stood, the room tilted the wrong way for a heartbeat, then corrected with a jolt like a film snapping onto a sprocket. On his way out, he stopped by the door because the urge to look back had become physical. He turned. His reflection had not moved. It still stood at the sink, hands on porcelain, head tilted in a posture of listening. The hairs rose at the base of his skull. He lifted his hand. In the mirror, the man at the sink did not lift his. He waited. He did not breathe. The man in the mirror then lifted his hand, slow, like a diver surfacing into cold, and touched the place on his chest where a folded page lived. Reyes's throat closed. He stepped back into the room hard enough that his shoulder hit the door jamb. The reflection caught up in a snap, now matched, as if it had been a trick of eye strain all along. He stood there until the ache in his shoulder turned sharp enough to be believable. He left the locker room and walked 5 circuits of the passageways before he let himself stop. He noted hatches, listened to pipes, measured his breathing against the ships. He made himself ordinary by doing ordinary things with calculation. In his rack, later, he dreamed without sleeping. He watched himself stand before the mirror, watched the tile behind him ripple into a map of the seam, watched blue-white lines sketch themselves over his skull like a navigator charting a coast no man had walked. He felt the pressure again in his jaw, the promise of a word that would not consent to be born. When he finally slept, a humid hour caught between bells. He carried the sound with him. Not his name, not a call sign. Just the sound of glass deciding which side of itself belonged to him. At 3 o'clock, he woke with a nosebleed, a clean thread of salt and iron down his lip. He stuffed tissue against it and lay back, staring at the red glow overhead. A drip somewhere in the locker room kept time with his pulse. The urge to go check the mirror was so strong, he had to sit on his hands. He didn't go. He watched dawn peel a shade lighter under the hatch, and when reveille finally came, he laughed in gratitude like a man reprieved. In the daylight, the locker room was just tile and glass, and the ghost of bleach. The mirror showed him human again. The lag, if there, hid itself behind speed. He washed his face without waiting for permission, and didn't look up until the water ran clean. On the way out, he glanced once more, just enough to be ordinary, and saw only himself. He raised a hand in ironic salute at the man in the glass. The man saluted back, flawless, on time. He walked away before he could find out whether the mirror kept saluting after he left. The envelope was waiting when Reyes returned to his compartment at 1910. His rack had been made with mechanical precision, corners tight, blanket smooth, though he hadn't touched it since dawn. The envelope lay dead center on the pillow. Manila, unmarked, edges too sharp to have been a board long. He shut the door behind him and stood still. The ship thrummed around him, steel bones vibrating, the sound of turbines pumping 1,000 miles of ocean beneath them. The envelope didn't move. No one delivered mail like this. Not at sea, not during deployment. He crossed the compartment, sat on the edge of the rack, and touched it. Smooth paper. New. He slid a glove finger under the flap and peeled it open. Inside, 6 photocopied pages. Radar plots, graphs, notation scrawled in handwriting that wasn't Navy standard. Each sheet smeared faintly, as if copied from an original already blurred. One page showed a sweep at 21:21, the exact time Reyes had first called visual on the seam. The return was a jagged spike, oversaturated, bleeding across the scope like lightning frozen in mid-flash. A date circled in red ink, March 11, 1972. Another page showed fuel curves that dipped in impossible steps, thousands of pounds lost in seconds, then restored, then lost again. A third page bore only one line of handwritten text, slashed in black ballpoint across the bottom margin. Subject in resonance. Reyes' stomach tightened. At 19:15, the door swung open. Carter stepped in without knocking, eyes wild. He froze when he saw the papers in Reyes' hands. "Where did you get those?" His voice cracked. "They were here." "No." Carter shook his head violently. "No, you don't just find those. Someone wants you to see them. Someone wants you to carry it." Reyes held up the page with the circled date. "It's our flight." Carter's breath came shallow. "I don't want to see it." He backed out into the passageway like the paper itself radiated poison. The door slammed behind him. Reyes sat alone with the envelope. At 19:23, he spread the pages across his desk. The lamp cast a narrow cone, leaving the corners in shadow. The photocopies looked older than they were, as though age had seeped into them in advance. He studied the radar plots, tracing the jagged lines with a fingertip. They matched his memory, the way the scope had stuttered and bent when the seam had opened. But no one else should have had these, not unless someone else had been watching. And then there was the phrase, subject in resonance. He repeated it under his breath. The words tasted clinical, detached. Subject, not Captain Elias Reyes, not a man, a variable. At 19:30, he heard boots in the passageway, voices, then the sound of laughter, sharp and forced, like men performing for whoever might be listening. He slid the pages back into the envelope, tucked it under his mattress, and sat with his hands on his knees until the footsteps faded. When the silence returned, he pulled it out again. He couldn't help himself. He flipped the last page. On the back, faint but visible where the copier hadn't caught it clean, were outlines, 3 silhouettes of aircraft, each drawn in black ink, navigation strobes marked as tiny stars. Beneath them, one word, absorbed. Reyes' chest tightened. He thought of 2, 3, for dissolving into light, their strobes breaking into shards. Whoever had made this knew. At 19:45, Reyes tried to trace the source. He checked the envelope. No markings, no initials, no naval mail code. Just Manila factory plane. The photocopies bore smears of toner, but no stamps. Whoever delivered them wanted the content to speak louder than the chain of custody. He thought of Carver's warning. Don't go looking for ghosts in the jets. What about ghosts in paper? At 2000 hours, he found himself writing on the back of one page, as if answering an exam. Yes, subject is in resonance. Yes, subject has heard the voices. Yes, subject is aware the recorder lies. He stopped, horrified by his own hand. He crumpled the page, shoved it into the waste can. But the waste can sat too close to the heat duct. The paper quivered in the draft, edges glowing faintly under lamplight, like they remembered the seam's brilliance. He snatched it out and flattened it again, smoothing wrinkles with a palm. He couldn't destroy it. Not yet. At 2012, the PA announced a routine drill. Men thundered through passageways. Reyes tucked the envelope inside his flight suit, pressed it against his chest as though his heart could guard it, and walked the length of the ship with the others. He felt eyes on him. Maybe they were just sailors glancing at an officer. Maybe they weren't. That night, alone again, he opened the envelope one last time. He placed the page with the circled date flat on the desk and laid his folded note, the one he had written about giving the corridor only what it wanted, on top of it. The 2 pages overlapped perfectly, edges aligned, as if made for each other. The ship groaned as it turned into wind. A deep shudder ran through the steel. The lamp flickered once, twice, and steadied. When Reyes lifted the top page, the red ink from the circled date had bled faintly onto his note beneath, ghosting a second circle around his own words. He stared until the ship's hum was the only thing keeping him tethered. At 2300 hours, he hid the envelope in a compartment under the deck plate. He told himself it was to keep it safe, but when he lay in his rack, staring at the red light, he realized it was to keep it away from his own hands. Still in the dark, he saw the word written in slashing black ink, repeating behind his eyes like the tick of the ship's clocks. RESO Nance. The logbook had the weight of a ritual object. Canvas cover faded by hands and salt. Pages ruled in blue. Columns for time, heading fuel, remarks. The same columns that made men believe the world could be tamed if you wrote it small enough. Reyes kept his under the pillow like a schoolboy hiding contraband. Not because he feared theft, but because he feared what he might write if it were too easy to reach. At 1:10, with the ship trimmed for night and the berthing compartment breathing slow, he pulled it out and set it on the desk. He turned the lamp down until the bulb glowed ember red. The log lay there with the patience of a confessional. He opened to March 11th. For names in the launch block, 3 names in the recovery block, crossed out, a remark, WX, comms degraded, that made Bao rise in his throat. He pressed 2 fingers to it, as if pressure could force the line to mean what it said. When he lifted them, the ink shone dull and unchanged. He took a pen and began with a form aloud, times, headings, altitudes, fuel. He wrote the honest numbers in the required words. When he reached remarks, his hand hovered. He wrote, anomalous corridor, then crossed it out so hard the pen nearly tore paper. He wrote, echoes of flight, and crossed that out too. He stared at the space, blank and ringing, and finally wrote, no further incident. He felt the lie all the way through his teeth. He flipped forward to a clean page, more to relieve the pressure than a plan. The paper smelled faintly of oil and humidity, of glue that had gone old in a warehouse. He closed his eyes, set the pen's tip on the page, and waited for the next honest sentence to arrive like a landing clearance. Nothing came, only the ship. He should have closed the book. Instead, he wrote, in a smaller hand than he used for the official record, if the corridor wants duty, I will give it the rest. He underlined it once, a captain trying to issue an order to himself. Then he capped the pen and sat back, listening to the ship tick. Something ticked back, not from the bulkhead, not from the deck, from the logbook itself. A tiny sound, paper on paper, like a page lifting and settling again in a gentle draft. Reyes frowned and glanced at the air vent. Dead calm. He touched the book's edge. The cover felt warm. He opened to the page he'd just left. The sentence he had written was still there, underlined, the ink dry into the fibers. Below it, a second sentence had appeared in a finer hand, almost print, so neat it made his teeth hurt. Do not give it your name. Reyes jerked, the chair legs squealing against deck. He looked at the door as if someone might be there, with a messenger's smirk. The passageway outside murmured with distant footsteps. No one stood at his hatch. He looked back at the page. The sentence remained, not etched, not indented, written. He turned a page, then back again, as if motion could unmake the words. He rubbed his thumb across the line. The ink didn't smear. He held the paper up to the lamp. The letters soaked the fibers the way his own did. If a trick, it was made with his materials. He uncapped the pen with hands that didn't feel like his and wrote beneath the new line, "Who is this?" He waited, suddenly conscious of how stupid the question would look to anyone who saw the page later. Half a minute passed. The ship breathed. The letters on the line above did not move. He almost laughed at himself. Then the pen in his hand twitched, as if the air had plucked its nib. He froze, careful not to let metal touch paper. Slowly, letters inscribed themselves beneath his question, neat, deliberate, wrong to the eye in exactly the way a left-handed writer's line looks wrong to a right-handed one. You are not alone. He dropped the pen. It rattled, rolled, stopped against the desk lip. He let out a breath hard enough to fog the lamp's glass shade. He wanted to call for Carter, for Carver, even for Dalton, anybody who could stand at his shoulder and witness. But he didn't move, as if shifting a muscle might break whatever thin. Obscene treaty had descended between page and air. "Who are you?" he asked aloud, quieter than prayer. The book did not answer. The page lay there with equal patience for human folly and miracle. He picked up the pen again. Something in him insisted on rules. If this was to happen, it would happen cleanly. He printed clearly, as if filling a customs form. Identify. The weight stretched long enough to make the skin between his shoulder blades itch. He began to think the previous lines had been the last trick his brain would play on him before fatigue finally knocked him cold. Then ink flowered on the line below his word, a single duck growing into a letter, another. The hand was not his. The rhythm of its strokes had a foreign patience. Echo, return, memory, not a name, a taxonomy, a shrug from something that did not need to call itself anything. He forced air into his lungs. Where are my men? He hadn't planned to ask it. The question leapt out at him like a flare over black water. He thought of Lyle's white knuckles, of the way to laugh with his back teeth, of Four's habit of tapping the throttle twice before a cat shot. He thought of wives and parents, and a baby blanket folded wrong. Ink gathered, stroked out 2 words with surgical cruelty. Within, intact, he wanted to tear the page out and shove it down the vent. He wanted to press his forehead to it until the letters bled into his skin. Intact where? He whispered to the glow. Inside what? The answer came slower this time, like a patient explaining to a child. The road keeps what it needs. Duty, cadence, vectors. His jaw ached. He wrote, angrier now than he'd let himself be with Colonel. They are not vectors. After a pause, the neat hand added only, names are yours to keep. He stared at that line for so long the words blurred. His throat hurt. He bent over the page until his breath pushed heat against paper. The logbook smelled suddenly like a rain-wet sidewalk, like summer on base, like home. His brain threw him anything it could keep him from going where the words pointed. He wrote, careful, each stroke a rivet. What do you want from me? The answer came without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for the cue. The heading. Reyes's lips moved on the old reflex of reply. 275. He didn't write it. The knowledge that he had almost handed it over made sweat break on his scalp. He gripped the edge of the desk until the skin around his nails went bloodless. He wrote instead, no. The pen hung for a moment, like a finger held in a scold. He expected anger, a reprimand shaped in perfect letters. When the ink came, it curved gentle. Then keep the names. Keep the rest. Do not speak the angle aloud. Do not write it here. He blinked hard. The room doubled and snapped back into one. A film splice he could not predict. He wrote, why me? Why am I not within with them? He didn't look up as the line formed. He could feel it. The tiny vibrations translating through the paper, through the heel of his hand, into the bones of his wrist. Conductor requires return path. His stomach turned over with an animal understanding he did not want to own. He saw the array at Groom Lake from a different story. He saw towers arcing light into a sky that changed its own terms. He saw his own body as a wire bridging a circuit too large to see. The room's air deepened around him, as if someone had closed a lid. He tore his eyes from the optical trap of the page and stared at the bulkhead until steel asserted itself. He wrote, smaller now, if I refuse, road will find another path. 2 beats. 3. Then, almost as an afterthought, road prefers a familiar. He closed the log, hands shaking hard enough that the cover thumped. The movement broke the spell. The ship rushed back into him. Pumps, fans, distant boot falls, a laugh cut short. He pressed the heel of his hand to his sternum until the urge to fold double subsided. He opened the book again because compulsion is a form of survival. The page had not changed. The sentences stayed written, neat, patient. He reached for the pen and scrawled across the bottom margin in a hand that looked like someone else's. I will not give you the heading. I will not give you my name. I will keep theirs. He blew the lamp out. Dark filled the compartment like water. He fell for the book in the hot afterimage of his own eyes and slid it under the pillow again, a ridiculous impulse to put the dangerous thing where his skull could cover it. He lay on his rack and listened to the ship count, as if the hull had learned numbers to keep men sane. He woke half an hour later with his mouth full of copper. He spat into the sink and watched the thread of red spool down. He wiped his lip with his wrist and returned to the desk. He flipped the log open with a jerk that made the binding complain. The page was clean. His sentence about names gone. The neat, inhuman hand gone. Even his first private line. If the corridor wants duty, gone. The fibers smooth as if no ink had ever lived there. He sagged back against the chair, all breath gone. He pawed through the book as if the words might have fled to a safer page. No mark, no indentation, no impression under raking light. It had taken the record and left him the memory. He laughed then, softly, with a sound like something breaking a long way away. He tore a fresh page out with care and wrote the largest, clumsiest letters he could fit in the space. You are not alone. He folded it twice and slid it into the same inner pocket as a line he'd salvaged the night before. He patted the pocket like a man confirming a passport. When he turned back, the log sat open and blank, innocent as a child. He closed it, bound it with a rubber band, wrapped in a T-shirt, and shoved it deep into the locker under a drift of socks no board of inquiry would ever trouble to lift. He leaned his forehead on the cool steel and let the ship's vibration enter his skull until it felt like a second heart. He whispered the names of his missing men into the locker, like the old stories said you whisper into a well, so that the earth will practice saying them back. He did not say the heading. He did not say his name. The launch was routine, until it wasn't. Reyes lifted from the deck at 2102, the KC-135 refueler droning steady under his hands. The night air over the Pacific stretched vast and clean, a black canvas pricked with indifferent stars. The sky smelled of jet fuel and salt, the kind of night where you could almost convince yourself the world would behave. At 2119, his stopwatch froze. He'd tapped it on instinct, the way he always did, leaving initial point, thumb quick and certain. The dial stopped halfway between 17 and 18 seconds, the sweep hand trembling but not moving. He frowned, tapped again. Nothing. The panel lights dimmed and brightened, not in rhythm with the generator, but in rhythm with his pulse. He could feel it. Thump, flare, as if the aircraft had grafted itself to him. Eagle Control, this is Tango Lead. Say again, fuel state reading, he called into the headset. His voice sounded hollow, bounced back at him as if the cockpit had become a room tiled in mirrors. No reply, only hiss. Then a tone like wind pulled across a bottle's lip. At 2121, the geometry arrived. It did not burst through the canopy like an intruder. It grew from inside the cockpit itself, beginning in the corners of his vision. Faint traceries of blue-white, like frost crawling across glass. Lines drew themselves over the throttle quadrant, patient and exact, mapping edges that had never existed. The yoke sprouted a lattice skin, glowing filaments coiling around the steel until his hands looked like shadows gripping light. Reyes's breath came shallow. He lifted one palm, hoping to break contact, but the lattice followed the gesture, climbing across his glove like ivy. The glow soaked into the fabric, then into the leather beneath, and finally into skin. His bones lit faintly as if he were an X-ray image brought to life. The cockpit was no longer a cockpit. Instruments blurred, needles trailing faint duplicates. The radar scope split into concentric circles, each one orbiting an invisible axis. Headings no longer numbers, but vectors sung in light. Heading. The whisper pressed into the hinge of his jaw. Not sound, not thought, something in between. No, Reyes said aloud, voice hoarse. Not mine. The stopwatch in his lap shimmered. Its frozen hand glowed bright, then fractured into 3 identical hands pointing at 3 different seconds, 3 truths superimposed. The glass over the dial bulged as if it were a lens looking back. Reyes clenched the yoke. The lattice flexed with him, as though the jet had been replaced by a living thing eager to be steered. He pushed left. There was resistance, not mechanical, but like trying to turn against the tide. The geometry wanted straight. The altimeter span flickered. 27,000, 34,000, 12,000, all in the space of heartbeat. He was rising, falling, accelerating, stalling, all in none. Eagle Control, do you copy? He tried again. His words echoed, bouncing, multiplying, until 3 versions of his own voice filled the cockpit, each delayed by a fraction of a second. The lattice brightened. His own reflection bloomed in the canopy glass, but not as alone. 3 versions, eyes wide, one opening its mouth before the others, one lagging behind. He felt vertigo as the lines of light bent around their faces, carving halos of cold fire. He closed his eyes, but the geometry didn't vanish. It lived under the lids, seared into nerves, constellations folding and unfolding in endless recursion. He saw the corridor again, not outside, but here, growing inside the frame of the jet. Duty, cadence, return. The words vibrated through his teeth. His grip faltered. The stopwatch dropped from his lap, clattering to the floor. It hit the deck with no sound. Instead, light spilled out, pooling like water, crawling up his boots. Reyes gasped, forcing himself to move. He bent, scooped the watch, clutched it hard enough to cut the skin of his palm on the metal. The hand still pointed at the wrong second, but now the dial glowed with lines, maps of somewhere he had never flown. He slammed the stopwatch into his thigh pocket, zipped it closed. The glow dimmed, retreating from his gloves, from the yoke, from the canopy glass. Not gone, waiting. At 21:27, the radios came alive again. Tango leads, say position, a voice, flat with static. Normal words, but thin, stretched, as if carried from far past the horizon. Reyes licked his lips. This is lead. Position, he glanced at the scope. 3 positions overlapped, each blinking in sequence. Position unknown. Silence, then copy. The word chilled him more than a reprimand would have. It sounded like permission. He flew another 20 minutes, each one brittle. The cockpit light steadied, gauges held, stopwatch stayed dead. But the lattice left its memory behind. Faint traceries on the inside of his eyelids, geometric scars etched into his sight. By 22:01, he landed. The deck crew waved him in, routine, ordinary, their hand signals crisp against the floodlights. No one else seemed to notice the afterglow still shimmering in his canopy. Reyes shut down, unbuckled, climbed down the ladder. His knees trembled. On the tarmac, he glanced back at the jet. For a moment, faint blue lines still clung to its frame, like veins of quartz and stone. Then the night swallowed them. He walked away, helmet under his arm, stopwatch pressing against his thigh like a brand. That night, in his compartment, he unzipped the pocket and set the watch on the desk. The dial glowed faintly, not from any loom, but from within, as if time itself had remembered being bent. He recorded into the cassette, March 14th. Stopwatch froze again. Cockpit compromised by lattice incursion. Geometry attempted to control heading. Refused. His voice shook. He added softer, it's inside now, not just outside. Inside. He clicked stop. The tape reel spun down. The silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed, steady as a second hand. The first time it happened on the ground, Reyes was driving a rusted Navy pickup along the perimeter road at dusk, a chore handed down by Dalton with the careful neutrality of a man who knew better than to let a pilot sit in his head too long. Fuel receipts, signatures, a courier run to the far pier and back. Nothing that required altitude or nerve. The Pacific lay to his left like hammered pewter. The carrier sat beyond the breakwater, a small gray city with a runway for a spine. He had the radio off. He had made a habit of that. Starved the air channels anything else could ride. The cab smelled of old coffee and vinyl baked by 1,000 suns. His knuckles were white on the wheel because it gave his body something homely to do. At a cross street, the light turned green. He took his foot off the brake. A truck the size of a barn ran the red from his right. He hadn't seen it. No horn. No skidding tires. Only a sensation. Something in his chest reaching forward and bracing, the way a man braces to lift weight. His right foot stamped the brake pedal to the floor before he could swear. The pickup howled. Tires chirped, seatbelt bit bone. The other truck, civilian, flatbed stacked with crates, roared past so close he could read the smear of a service station sticker on his tailgate. He sat there breathing hard, eyes unfocused, feeling the steering wheels grain through his palms as if cataloging it for a report. The light swung back to red. He put the truck in park and laid his forehead on the heel of his hand. He had not decided to brake. The decision had been made somewhere without him and delivered to his muscles as an order, a heading, and he had turned, 275, but for legs. That night, he told no one. If he told Dalton, he'd get grounded from driving, then from walking. If he told Carver, the older man would watch him with a new, quiet care that felt too close to pity. If he told Carter, the kid would nod like a drowning man nods when a wave names itself. So he told the tape, because the tape would keep nothing. March 15th, he said into the microcassette's cheap little microphone, intervention, anticipation without stimulus. Reflex not mine. The tape hissed with polite indifference, already erasing him. He slept badly. When the voices came, they didn't use words. They were a pressure wave against the cartilage of his ears, and behind his sense like the weight of a palm between his shoulder blades, urging him down a corridor without doors. The second time, it was rain. A squall rose fast, blown in from nowhere, through cold sheets across the pier where mechanics were wrestling a pallet jack, whose wheels had decided the Navy was optional. Reyes stepped out of the passageway into a world that had gone gray and liquid. Sailors hunched, cursed, laughed in that way men laugh when they have no intention of letting the weather win. He reached for the top case of a stack to steady it, then stopped. His hand hung in the air. He saw very clearly. The case slipped, fall, smashed 3 toes on the boot of the youngest man there. Ensign Lyle, of course, because fate always picks a new kid. And he saw Lyle hide the pain and limp for 3 months and wash out of the squadron on a medical that would make him a clerk in San Diego forever. He stepped left, took the weight 2 seconds before the case actually slid. To everyone watching, it looked like he had fast hands. To him, it felt like catching a thrown plate you hadn't known was in the room. Lyle grinned without gratitude. No one clapped. The squall hammered the deck. Reyes walked away with rain dripping off his nose and felt dirty with luck. He went to flight surgeon because it was what the manual would have asked of him if the manual had ever expected the corridor to follow a man ashore. The doc peered into his pupils, tapped reflexes, asked about sleep, appetite, libido, the holy trinity of peacetime concern. Reyes said his sleep was fine, his appetite was fine. His libido was none of the Navy's business. The doc wrote numbers in a chart. "You're jumpy," he said. "You been jumping?" Reyes said, "No," and wanted to laugh because he had been nothing but jumping from reality to reality, from second to second. He left with salt pills and a pamphlet about stress that said the cure was sunlight and meaningful conversation. The third time, he was back in the ready room, watching a training reel he'd seen 500 times. An F4 on short final, high on the ball, the LSO's hands describing the sacred geometry of a save. The projector flickered. A sailor bumped a cart. The image undulated. Reyes felt his stomach fall. "Wave him," he said without thinking. "Sit down, Captain," Dalton said, irritated. On the screen, a beat later, the LSO waved a jet. The pilot went burners and roared over the round down. The hook sparked on the deck edge in a line of angry light. Someone whistled. "Close one," Carver said. Reyes's hands shook. He folded them under his arms. He could feel Dalton's eyes on the back of his neck, like a hot rifle muzzle. Afterward, Dalton called him into the closet. They called an office because closets don't have windows. He shut the door with exquisite care. "You aren't on schedule and you aren't on deck, and still you are in it," he said, not cruelly. "What are you doing to my ship, Captain?" Reyes sat on his hands, so he would not reach for the stopwatch in his pocket. "I'm breathing, sir," he said, "and sometimes the air pushes back." Dalton stared at him for a long count. "Get out of my office." The changes spread like hairline cracks in a thick canopy. Time came in uneven gulps. In conversation, he would hear the next sentence forming in the air as the current one was said, the way you sometimes know a joke's punchline from the setup, only this was orders or latitudes, or the kind of sentence that breaks men. He walked around them like furniture, when he could. When he couldn't, he put a hand out and steadied the nearest object, so the room wouldn't pitch. He started seeing pathways laid over ordinary space. In the wardroom line, a thin, bright thread would connect his hand to a coffee cup, and then to Carver's table as a drawing the only acceptable route. He could choose not to follow it. If he did, the thread tugged at his jaw hinge until his molars throbbed. He learned small disobediences. Step off the line by an inch. turn left instead of right, but pause at the exact second the thread would have demanded. As if to say, I'm listening, I'm not obeying. The pressure would ease, the way a river will let you stand in it if you face the current. At night, the voices grew less like men and more like weather pressure gradients, isobars pressing across his dreams. He woke with his jaw aching from clenching against instructions no human had given. He started writing the names of his missing men on scrap paper and pencil, then erasing them, then writing them again. He told himself it was to keep the names limber, to keep them from wearing grooves in his brain. He knew it was also to test whether the world would erase them for him. It did not. The world seemed content to let him carry that weight, as long as he didn't speak the heading aloud. On March 18th, Dalton put him back in a cockpit, not to fly, to sit. Familiarization, the schedule said, as if the phantom were a dog that had forgotten his face. Reyes climbed the ladder and lowered himself into the seat and buckled in like a man tie himself to a mast for an experiment in storms. He set his hands on the stick and throttle. The cockpit smelled of warm plastic and the thousand separate oils men bring on board in their skin and leave behind in seams. He closed his eyes and waited for the geometry. It didn't come. He opened his eyes and stared at the dead panel, the needles at their humane zeros. He reached for his stopwatch. It had not run since the night it froze at 21:19. He hadn't tried to make it. He'd been afraid that if it started, it would drag the corridor on its second hand. He clicked the crown. The hand did not move. He clicked it again, a man testing a broken tooth with his tongue. Again. The third click felt like it went somewhere. He didn't hear it. He didn't see it. He felt it. A tiny handhold shifting in a climbing wall he couldn't see. The second hand jumped a fraction and stopped again. In his jaw, the pressure shifted to an ache that made his eyes water. He thumbed the crown once more and took his finger away like he had touched a wire. Nothing, but the room had tilted. He sat very still until the ache ebbed. "No," he said to the dead panel, to the canopy, to the seam that wasn't there. "You don't tune me. I don't tune you." He unbuckled, climbed down. On the hangar deck, a wrench clanged off something it shouldn't have. Reyes flinched before it fell. Carver, across the bay, saw him flinch and did not comment. He started running at night, laps around the flight deck. The wind strong enough to make tears fly out his eyes and leave salt on his ears. The carrier moved under him, carving black lanes through blacker water. He ran until his lungs burned because the pain in his ribs was his and not borrowed. On the third lap one night, he stopped at the foul line and lifted his head like a dog, catching a scent and stepped back as a yellow shirt ran out of the dark, pushing a tow bar where Reyes' knee had been a heartbeat earlier. The kid had his head down against the wind, hood up, blind to anything but the job. Reyes' pulse hammered. The deck floods made halos in the mist and turned every man into a piece of theater. He put his hands on his hips and laughed until he had to spit. It felt good to hear himself. Later, in the shower, hot water drummed his skull. He leaned his forehead against tile and tried to count how many times the push had saved him and how many times he had ignored on principle and paid small prices. A bumped shoulder, a spilled cup, a bark shin that bled like a confession down into a sock. He wasn't sure which ledger he wanted to be in. He dreamed that night of standing in a cornfield he'd never seen, listening to wind talk in a tongue he almost knew. When he woke, his jaw ached from having clenched through an argument he couldn't remember having. The fourth time was the one Carver saw. They were on the catwalk, two men watching the deck's ballet in a pause between cycles. Carver lit a cigarette with the kind of disapproval a man saves for himself. He didn't offer Reyes one. "You look better," he said. "By which, I mean you look like a man who has decided which way he will break." Reyes rested his forearms on the cold rail. "Did I decide?" Everyone does. Or the decision is made for them, and they pretend they did it. They watch the crew move an A, for like ants moving a leaf, tiny men scandalously entrusted with mass and momentum. The wind tore the smoke away from Carver's mouth and gave it to the sea as a sacrament. Reyes felt the push in his jaw before he saw anything. He turned his head left, small, almost nothing. A bolt flew past where his face had been, a silver blur, that took a long time to clatter into audibility. It struck the deck, bounced twice, and spun to a stop with the complicated joy of metal finding resonance. Carver's eye tracked it. His face didn't change. "How many times?" he asked. "Enough to know I'm not being careful," Reyes said. Carver nodded, dropped the cigarette overboard like a libation. "We'll call it skill and leave God out of it." Reyes didn't laugh. "It isn't God." "No," Carver said. "It's worse." He pushed off the rail. "Get some sleep, Reyes. And if you start knowing things before they happen, come tell me after they happen, not before." "Why after?" "Because I still like to pretend luck works." By then Reyes had learned which parts of the ship answered to him, as if he were a tuning fork, and which parts did not. The metal remembered more than men did. It anticipated his steps, echoed his heartbeat, handed him back a blush of his own rhythm, so that walking alone at night felt like being accompanied by a polite ghost. The comms panel in the ready room crackled half a second before a PA announcement every time, as if translating. The tape in his locker was heavy, or light depending on whether the day had asked him to say, "Notice something that was not a person." He found he could sometimes refuse the nudge. Let the truck run the red and miss him by a paint thickness without touching the brake, just to prove to something that he was not a wire. Let the case fall and catch it a beat later and still save Lyle's toes, to prove to himself that the path could be curved by muscle and attention, not just by surrender. The ache in his jaw would punish him for an hour, then forgive. He wondered, on the nights he ran, whether the corridor was learning him as he learned it, whether this was partnership or domestication. The thought made his skin itch. He carried the folded page in his inner pocket and touched it like a man touches a medal he didn't ask for. He did not take the stopwatch out of his flight suit unless he had to. He did not tap its crown. He did not speak the heading out loud, even in sleep, though twice he woke with his mouth formed around the syllable "two" and bit the tip of his tongue hard enough to bring blood, as if he could cauterize the word there. On March 21st at 4:40, he woke into a silence so complete it burned. No ship, no pumps, no fans, no breath but his own. He lay in the dark and thought, "I have outlived the world." Then the sound returned in a wave. Steel, water, human animal, and under a tone he had learned to recognize as his own body being measured by something vast. He whispered to the ceiling, to the pipes, to the page over his heart, "You will not take the heading." The tone did not answer. It didn't need to. He felt its attention pivot, like a dish. He got up, put on boots, and walked to the ladder well. As he reached for the rail, a hand, not flesh, not presence, a suggestion, pressed the small of his back. 275, it said without words. The familiar. He took the ladder anyway, but he turned his shoulders the wrong way at each landing, as if to remind the ship that a human body has corners a vector doesn't. When he stepped onto the flight deck, the sky was a navy paler than the sea, the seam between them drawn clean. For a queer, grateful second, the horizon behaved. Then, at the edge of sight, 3 small strobes blinked once where no aircraft flew. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. They did not blink again. He stood there until his knees hurt and the sun unrolled a thin blade of light at the rim of the world. He went below when reveille came, because that's what men do. The altered man shaved, drank coffee, and signed a form saying he had slept 8 hours. The altered man could still be ordinary. For now, the motel was the kind the Navy never booked for officers, but which itinerant men found anyway. Anchorage in late March was a city of melting snowbanks, of wind that smelled of jet fuel and fish, of parking lots glazed with old salt. Reyes walked into the lobby with his collar up and his head down. The desk clerk didn't ask for ID. He slid a brass key across the counter with the indifference of someone who had seen too many uniforms, too many men who wanted to be invisible. Room 207 was at the far end of the second floor, down a corridor lined with cracked ice machines and carpeting that smelled faintly of cigarettes from another decade. The key turned too easily in the lock, like the door had been opened often. Inside, 1 bed, 1 desk, 1 lamp that buzzed when lit. The window framed a parking lot, where 3 cars sat snow-crusted and alone. Reyes set his duffel down and sat on the bed without removing his jacket. The mattress springs groaned. That was when he saw the envelope, not on the desk, on the pillow. Again, manila, thin, unmarked. He stared at it for a long time, as though eye contact might reveal its origin. His heart drummed in his throat. He stood across the room and picked it up. Light weight, papers inside, maybe 4 or 5 sheets. He sat at the desk, lamp humming, snow tapping the window in uneven rhythm. He opened it. The first page was a cover sheet, plain black type stamped across the top. Project Sentinel, Case File 47B. Subject, Captain Elias Reyes, USN. Status, in resonance. Below a line, observation ongoing. Containment measures insufficient. His mouth went dry. The second page was worse. It looked like a medical report married to a flight log. His name appeared again in the header, followed by notations in clipped technical language. Subject exhibits anticipatory responses prior to stimuli. Subject resists heading transmission, but remains within corridor influence. Subject continues to preserve identifiers, names, as ballast against integration. Subject demonstrates increasing permeability between vessel and corridor structure. Reyes pressed his palm flat to the paper. It was warm, impossibly warm, like it had been sitting on a radiator. He snatched his hand back and stared. The paper looked ordinary. The third page was a chart. Graph lines jagged up and down, labeled with times and headings. At the top, March 14 to 21:21 hours. That was the night the cockpit had dissolved into lattice. The graph line for that minute spiked off the axis, red pen circling it like an open wound. In the margin, handwriting, not typed, scrawled in black ink. Threshold exceeded. Subject maintained self. Reyes's chest tightened. Maintained self. Who had written that, and who had expected otherwise? The fourth page was typed but broken. Phrases scattered, as if copied badly or translated from a machine. Conductor requires return path. Resonance deepening. Subject carries him internally. Integrity of boundary compromised. Recommend escalation, retrieval, or absorption. He read the word absorption 3 times. It refused to soften. The fifth page was blank at first glance. He held it under the lamp. Faint impressions rose in the cheap motel light, like the ghost of carbon paper. Words traced themselves as if waiting for his recognition. "We see you, Elias." The letters glowed faintly blue, then dimmed, leaving only the paper. Reyes's chair screeched as he shoved back from the desk. His pulse hammered in his jaw. He pressed his fist to his temples. "Who put this here?" His voice sounded small, absurd against a motel wallpaper. "Who the hell put this here?" Silence answered. Only the lamp buzzed. Only the snow tapped. Only the radiator groaned. He stood, envelope in hand, and went to the window. The parking lot looked deserted. The cars sat crusted in snow, exhaust frozen from mornings long past. But there, one shape, a black sedan idling with no lights, parked at the far corner. He could just make out 2 silhouettes inside. Watching? Waiting? He killed the lamp. The room plunged into a darkness relieved only by the sodium orange glow outside. He crouched by the bed, envelope clutched to his chest, breathing shallow through his teeth. The snow kept falling. At 2300 hours, he forced himself to sit again at the desk. He spread the papers once more. He took the motel stationery pad and wrote in block letters, "This is Captain Elias Reyes, United States Navy. Who is observing me?" He waited. Nothing. He tore the page out, folded it, and slid it into the envelope with the others. He sealed it with spit, childish but final, and tucked it under mattress. Then he sat on the bed's edge and pressed his palms together until they ached. Sleep came in bursts. He dreamed of the cockpit again, but it wasn't a cockpit. It was a motel room, walls dissolving into lattice, the bed frame drawing itself into lines of blue-white geometry. The envelope glowed brighter than the lamp, light bleeding through the mattress. Subject in resonance. The dream whispered. He woke with his hands gripping the bedsheet, so tightly the fabric tore. At 4 o'clock, Reyes, dressed, packed, left the key at the counter without looking at the clerk. Outside, the lot lay silent. The black sedan was gone, tracks already softened by snow. He drove away, the envelope still under the mattress, left behind because he couldn't decide whether it was a weapon or a leash. Still, as he merged onto the highway toward base, he felt the words beating in his skull, like a pulse not his own, subject in resonance. They filed as a ferry hop, an hour in clean air to shuffle a jet from Elmendorf back to the carrier's deck cycle. Reyes launched at 1540 in a borrowed Phantom with tired paint and a panel that buzzed at a frequency that got under his teeth. The sky over the Gulf of Alaska was scrubbed clear by a wind that smelled of iron and thaw. Anchorage fell away behind him, a grid pinned to gray. Ahead, open water, open time. He kept it simple. Level at 20,000. Fuel a tight budget his hands could feel without looking. Radio's routine. A flight you could do while building a grocery list. At 1607, the grocery list abandoned him. He looked down to check his stopwatch, the dead one he carried as a relic, the one that still insisted on 2119 like a shrine, and found his other clock wrong. The panel chronograph said 1607. The sun said later. His body said earlier. A simple unthreading, like someone had pulled 2 inches out seam the day and not bothered to stitch it back. He told himself he'd misread a shadow and keyed to Mike Center, Viper 1, estimating pop-up weather off the bow. Request deviation 2 degrees left to avoid. No answer, not even a courtesy squawk. The frequency sounded full and empty at once, like a party down the hall you were not invited to. He scanned the horizon. No clouds. No bloom of weather radar. No seam. He saw the seam anyway. Not the chalk mark across the universe. Not the bright wound he'd followed before. A paler thing. Almost an idea of brightness, as if the air had remembered it had once been cut there and had chosen to leave a scar. He flew on, because the human alternative was to stop at 20,000 feet and ponder that scar until the engine flamed out. At 1612, the altimeter lost its conviction. It hesitated at 20, jumped 50 feet, reconsidered. The vertical speed needle twitched with the uneasy politeness of a man in a crowded elevator. Fuel held steady, obedient. Airspeed stayed true. The horizon, honest, unalarmed, offered him a faithful line. He understood, then, what would happen. The corridor didn't need a seam anymore. It had learned the shape of him. It could find him in the middle of a perfectly good sky. He breathed out once, slow. "We're not doing this," he said, to the air, to the jet, to the fold that had started to form around him like a hand closing. The fold closed. It was not dramatic. No flash, no angels. The world simply went quiet in a way that made him think of snowfall, of sound taken into the cloth of everything. The engine noise remained, a steady spool, but it belonged to a different room now. The radios just withdrew like a tide. The stick grew light, then heavy, then light again, as if gravity were a suggestion still under negotiation. The horizon softened, then ceased to be a horizon. It became a curved surface that might have been outside him, or might have been inside of his own skull. Stars appeared where there had been none. Thin, bright, arranged in patterns no shipboard almanac would own. Constellations practiced other shapes, folded out of the old like a cat stepping out a coil of rope it had slept in. He was no longer flying through air so much as over something that permitted the imitation of air. He checked his position, out of reflex. The scope answered with 3 blips in sequence, spaces evenly as beadwork, each labeled with his own call sign and time-stamped with times that were not possible in this universe. Behind the blip stretched a dotted line that did not point back to Alaska or forward to sea but down, as if the world had an underlay you could file a route on. The first machine floated into view then, hanging in the middle distance. Reyes had no words for it. His mind tried, obediently, antenna, bridge, array. Each word snapped like bad bungee when he put weight on it. It wasn't built from materials he recognized. It looked like an equation had decided to be hollow and generous, and had rearranged its terms to make space inside itself. Along its surfaces, light ran in disciplined flows. Current in circuit traces, except the traces were the size of ships, and the current was made of stars drilled small and poured through. He banked without deciding to. The jet slid along a curve that hadn't been in front of him until he needed it. The machine swung past slowly. Along its edges were mounted things like instruments. Compass roses exploded into planes. Sextants melted into lattices. Gyros that precess against rules he had been tested on in classrooms that suddenly seemed profoundly provincial. It made no sound. It threw no shadow. Beyond it, others hung. Some were small as boats. Some were immense as stadiums. All hung as if lulled by a tide too patient to be seen. They were arranged with the care of an engineer building a bridge out of a cathedral. And as I kept finding ratios, 1 to 2 to 3, angles that felt just to a body that had learned the good angles by flying into the bad, curves that matched the curve of human wrists when human wrists are allowed to be elegant. He tried the mic again. Center, Viper 1. I'm in a volume that... He stopped. He didn't know what volume meant when the room had no walls and no loyalty to distance. The radio gave him his own voice back 2 seconds later, a ghost delayed. I'm in a volume that... The echo cut off before the sentence could die a second time. The corridor had indulged him and then gotten bored. He looked down. Below him there was no earth. There was a surface, if surface was a word, made of the same coherent light the machines drank. It wasn't liquid. It wasn't solid. It was intention made flat. Across it moved shapes you could call ships if you had never seen ships. He wanted to say they were elegant. He wanted to say they were terrible. He settled on sufficient, because that was the word his training had given him for machines that did not make mistakes you could fix. He thought, this is not space. This is not sea. This is the inside of a rule. The stopwatch in his pocket grew warm. He did not take it out. He didn't have to. Its face had impressed itself into his thigh over months, like a coin rubbed for luck. Now the heat drew that impression deeper, until he felt he might be branded with 2119 through cloth and skin and bone. He put his palm against his thigh until pressure gave him back to himself. A thread of brightness unspooled ahead of him. It did not ask. It told. His jaw answered with ache, the hinge complaining like a door in a longhouse. He let the jet follow for 1 heartbeat, 2, long enough to learn the curve, and then he came off at 1 degree, a small betrayal. The ache eased a fraction. He could work with fractions. A machine opened beside him like a flower, obeying a clock. He could not see. Inside lay a chamber as big as a football field, lined with scaffolds that were not scaffolds, each hung with objects the size of men and the size of meteors. He knew a cradle when he saw one. He did not want to know what they thought a cradled thing should grow into here. It occurred to him that he was seeing only what he was allowed to name. The rest slipped behind a blind spot of his training, the way the human eye obligingly edits the edge of its own optic nerve out of the picture, so you can drive without panic. He forced himself to count. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, thirds and halves. The old trick a flight surgeon had taught him when the inner ear went loud. Numbers gave shape. Shape gave back a floor you could stand on. The floor hummed in reply, as if a mathematician had been pleased by his effort. Lines rose around him like music staves, each line a pitch, each pitch a path. To 7-5, his mouth said, not on transmit, not even loud enough to startle himself. He clamped his teeth down so fast he tasted copper, did not speak the angle. The logbook had told him that. With a hand not his own, he held the warning behind his teeth, like a wafer. Something noticed. Attention moved. Not a spotlight, not a searchlight, but the way a school of fish moves when predator arrives. A pressure shift in the medium. He felt it touch him along the line where flyer becomes machine. The ridge of the mask, the skull under the helmet, the wrists where tendons show when you pull a jet into obedience. Conductor requires return path. He hadn't forgotten the phrase. The phrase had not forgotten him. He saw them then, not the machines. The men, 3 silhouettes ahead, blurred by distance or by rule, their phantoms preserved in the way amber preserves a fly without pity or malice. Their wings were correct, their tails a little wrong, as if a child had drawn them from memory and the memory had been better than the drawing. Their strobes blinked out of rhythm with each other. He could not see faces. He could not see movement. He could not be sure he saw anything at all but an arrangement of permission that happened to match his grief. 2, he said, because grief makes liars of the orders you give your own mouth. 3, 4. The first silhouette stuttered. The second flared. The third collapsed into a spiral of light that threaded itself back into the road below and vanished, as if some clerk had filed it correctly at last. Reyes closed his eyes. When he opened them, the machines were nearer, or he had been brought nearer. Guided on a rail, he could not feel until it moved him. He did the only thing he trusted. He added noise. He rocked the jet on its axis half a degree, a pilot's fidget. He reached for a non-existent trim wheel and clicked it 2 to tenths he didn't need. He made himself human in a room that did not require it. Something like disappointment passed through the medium, or he invented the disappointment he wanted to anger. The thread brightened again, offering the generous line to the generous curve. He let the nose follow enough to keep the 8 down, then cheated again. The world permitted it and took note. He thought of names. He said them in his head in the cadence the ready room used to read off who flew where. Last names, then first initials, each a syllable shaped like a man. He could feel the machines trying those names on their frames, as if to see whether names added useful ballast. He denied them the shape of the syllables with stubbornness old as childhood. A structure unfolded off his right, surfaces articulating with delicacy that made his chest hurt. Inside, objects hung that were not objects, each one more resolved the longer he tried not to see it. One was a corridor like the corridor he had flown into on the first night, but oriented wrong. Every rule mirrored. One was a sphere that refused to be a sphere if he looked it straight on. Only in peripheral vision did it admit roundness. One was an instrument panel peeled out of phantom and spread flat like a map, its needles frozen at values that made a diagram of despair. Each object tugged at the bone behind his ear the way a doctor tests a reflex with a rubber hammer. He refused and refused and refused. The air, if air, grew thinner around his mouth. His breath sounded like someone else pulling thread off a spool. The engine note climbed a hair without the touch agreeing. His body took notice of these lies and filed them under death later. The part of him that had survived cat shots at night filed them under noted. A corridor within the room, a path within the path. Open ahead. It had the clean inevitability of a runway when the crosswind drops. If he took it, he knew. There would be no question left to answer. He would be in the room as a tool is in a box. He split the difference. He skimmed its edge, let the slipstream kiss the generous rail, and then stepped sideways into air that pretended to resist. The ache in his jaw went sharp, then eased, the way a father sighs when a child disobeys intelligently. Something enormous passed overhead. He did not look up. Looking up felt like kneeling. He flew for a time measured only by the number of times he had to remind his hands they were allowed to shake. The machines receded, either because he fled them or because they had shown what they needed to and now had other work. The stars rearranged themselves back into lies he knew. The horizon remembered itself. The radios has returned, then the busy human chatter that makes men brave. Center to Viper 1. Radar contact regained. You drop for a minute there. Friend. Say state. He stared at his panel. Fuel had not moved. Altitude had the humor to read exactly 20,000 feet. The chronograph said 1613. He had seen a space big enough to hang an idea in. He had met machines that had never been boys. The world said he had eaten 6 minutes. Viper 1, he said. His voice sounded like it had walked a long way to meet him. State. Good. Copy, Viper 1. Proceed. Proceed. As if the word could be ordinary again. As if the line he followed had not followed him back. He landed at 1701 local, a number that made paperwork easy. The deck took him with the practiced forgiveness of a ship that had snatched 1,000 pilots out of the air and would take 1,000 more. He rolled to a stop, canopy cracking. Cold salt air stamped his lungs. On the way to the island, he touched his thigh. The stopwatch burned through fabric, a coal without flame. In the ready room, men nodded the way men do when the number of chairs is right again. Dalton looked at him once, a half measure, then away. He wrote N.O. further incident in a box that did not deserve the words and signed his name where the Navy insisted he put it, in his rack that night, the ship humming under him like a bass string. He lay awake and told the ceiling a simple sentence with a simple verb, the way you talk to a child you love enough to teach. You don't get my heading, he said. From somewhere not outside and not inside came a pause that had nothing to do with mercy. Then the pressure in his jaw eased the smallest degree, an engineer's tolerance. The corridor had learned him a fraction. He had learned a fraction. Fractions make bridges you can walk if you don't look down. He slept. The missing miles did not return to the map. He woke with their absence curled up at the base of his skull, an animal that had decided, for now, to live there. The sky was clean when he launched. Clean skies were always suspect now. Reyes rolled off a carrier at 2011, burners trailing twin spears into the Alaskan dusk, and told himself he would keep it simple. Up to 25,000, a wide circuit, then home. Nothing fancy. Nothing that left room for the seam. But the seam was no longer a place. It was a presence. By 2023, the cockpit began to tremble, not the vibration of engine harmonics or the steady buffeting of wind shear. This was deeper, a shudder that worked its way through the airframe into his bones, as though the jet were remembering something his body had forgotten. The gauges lied first. The altimeter stuttered. 25,000, then 32,000, then 14,000. The airspeed tape jittered like a lie detector in panic. The fuel gauges leapt between impossible values. Full, then empty, then hovering at half as though mocking him. He slapped the glass, a pilot's reflex, but the needles twitched in defiance. The stopwatch, dead for days, glowed in his pocket. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Its presence radiated heat through the flight suit, marking his thigh with a circle of fire. Then the lattice arrived. Not outside this time. Inside. Blue-white lines coiled up the canopy arch like frost on glass. They traced the throttle, the stick, the harness straps. They reached into his helmet, across his visor. Lines sketched across the inside of his vision. His own reflection stared back at him with eyes bracketed by geometry. The jet bucked. Control, this is Tango lead. Declaring instrument failure, he said into the radio. Static answered. Dense and steady, not the hiss of distance but the silence of refusal. Heading, the whisper said. Not sound, not thought. Pressure in the jaw hinge, in the place where bone meets muscle. Heading. Reyes gritted his teeth. Not mine. The yoke stiffened. He hauled it left. The jet responded sluggishly, as though caught in syrup. The lattice brightened, threads tightening around his hands, around the steel, trying to teach him obedience by example. The horizon tilted, then split. 2 lines, then 3, each one insisting it was level. Stars smeared into arcs. The sea below glowed faint, a chalk drawing on dark slate. The stopwatch in his pocket pulsed against his thigh, hot as iron. Heading. Reyes slammed the stick forward, dove 10,000 feet in 20 seconds. The G-force pressed him back, his vision tunneling gray, blood dragging reluctant through veins. The lattice screamed without sound, its lines vibrating, trying to snap him back into place. No, he gasped. His throat burned. You don't fly me. The altimeter spun, the VSI pegged. Warning lights flickered red, amber, green, white. Every alarm shrieking at once like a choir gone insane. The cockpit shook so hard his teeth rattled, but the jet was still his. For now. He yanked back on the yoke, felt the airframe groan as it leveled, wings shuddering with the stress. His heart hammered. Sweat soaked the lining of his helmet. The lattice pulsed, angry now, filling the canopy with blinding lines, geometry, so bright he had to squint. It wanted his hands. It wanted his voice. It wanted him to give the heading. He bit down until his jaw screamed. Not mine. The stopwatch burst from his pocket, launched by a force that wasn't gravity. It spun in the air between him and the canopy, glowing brighter than any instrument. Its hand moved now, ticking not seconds but angles, 275, 275, 275. Each tick pounded into his skull. Reyes snatched it midair, wrapped his fist around it, and slammed it against the console. The glass shattered. Light spilled like liquid, running across the panel, dripping into seams, crawling toward his gloves. He screamed and punched it again. The stopwatch cracked, got spilling gears that weren't gears at all but shards of light, wriggling like insects. They scattered across the floor, burrowed into the deck, vanished. The lattice dimmed. The cockpit steadied, gauges twitching back toward plausible values. The radio crackled. Human voices, faint but real, like a shoreline at night. Tango lead, you copy? Reyes's breath came ragged. His fist bled where the glass had cut him, blood running down the throttle, soaking into the cracks. He pressed the mic switch with shaking fingers. Lead copies. Say state. He swallowed, looked at the gauges. Fuel low but survivable. Altitude honest. Airspeed holding. His own body was shaking hard enough to rattle his harness. State, good, he lied. Proceed. Proceed, the Navy's favorite word. As if proceeding were neutral, as if it didn't mean yielding to something waiting. Reyes forced his hand back onto the yoke. The blood made it slippery. He gripped harder, hissed through his teeth. You don't fly me, he whispered again. Outside, the horizon stitched itself back together. The stars blinked steady. The ocean below lost its glow, went black, went human again. But in his ears, faint as a heartbeat, the corridor's voice lingered. Resistance is also resonance. They took his name off the board. It happened between breakfast and the first launch. The whiteboard that had once been a living thing. Call signs arrayed in a grid of hope and dread, arrows and times. Fuel loads annotated in grease pencil. Stood mute when Reyes walked into the ready room at 6:50. On yesterday's Matrix, his call sign had sat in the slot that made sense for a man like him. Section lead. Recovery window C. Tanker on the third cycle if weather held. Today, in the neat hand of the duty officer, his square was blank. No Tango. No Reyes. A sterile rectangle of unassigned sky. Carver caught his eye and didn't hold it. Lyle stared at the floor. The room's air had the brittle smell of too much coffee and not enough sleep. Dalton said nothing. He stood at the back with his arms folded. A man watching the tide pull down a sandcastle and deciding not to pretend it would hold. Schedule update? Reyes said, because the part of him that wore uniform still required a ritual. Medical grounding 48 hours, Dalton said, as if reciting from a weather bulletin. I already clear medical. Dalton's jaw moved once, then call a command discretion. The projector clicked to life. The brief began without him. Weather, case recovery, tanker track, threat. The LSO gave the same talk he always gave on the geometry of humility. Men nodded and pretended it was new. Reyes sat in the back row and took a blank sheet from a clipboard and wrote nothing on it. He listened to cadence, the duty in the room, and felt it slide past him like rain off wax. They launched the first deck load at 8:05. Reyes watched from the island catwalk. Head set off so no voice could ride it into his skull. Jet after jet rolled, bowed, bellowed, vanished into the gray. He tracked each one with the small involuntary tilt of his head that pilots do when they cannot help flying with their necks. He could taste the launch steam on his tongue, the sweet copper sting. He felt the pressure in his jaw, tried to turn his chin to 275, and refused it almost without thinking, a hand batting away a housefly. Enjoying the show, said a voice beside him. He didn't have to look to know it was Carver. The older man leaned on the rail, with a posture borrowed from men who had spent years making a show of not minding. A cigarette dangled unlit between two fingers. He wasn't allowed to smoke up here, but he liked the prop. They took my name off the board, Reyes said. They took your name off their board. Carver corrected, gentle. Boards are not the world. Feels like the world. Feels like the piece of it you know how to steer. Carver flicked the cigarette overboard anyway. You know how to steer other things. Like what? Like yourself. That's the hard one. A green shirt waved. A deck-edge light blinked. A phantom landed short and angry, hook skipping, tires kissing steel, then catching. The arresting wire sang. Reyes's hands twitched uselessly in air. A man catching an invisible ball. Carver watched his hands. You're still flying, he said softly. That's the problem. They found him a job with numbers. At 10 o'clock, he was assigned a metal desk wedged under air ducts in a space without windows. The desk held a squadron log, a dull pencil, and a stack of forms that still smelled of mimeograph spirit. Maintenance tallies, sortie durations, fuel receipts, the bureaucratic bones of flight made into paper. The yeoman who showed him the chair kept his voice carefully neutral, as if speaking in the wrong tone might call down a weather change. "You want me to write," Reyes said. "I want you to be occupied," the yeoman said, not unkind. He sat. He filled boxes. He rounded numbers up or down with the piety of a man who once believed precision was a moral good. He wrote his name where the line asked for "prepared by," and felt the letters sit wrong under his hand, like borrowed boots. From somewhere down the passage came the familiar vibrations of the ship's public address system readying to speak, the tiny harmonics that precede human voice. He felt the push in his jaw, the invitation to look up, to tilt his head toward a bearing that had nothing to do with this room. He kept his eyes on the dull pencil and the duller form, and whispered to the ductwork, "No." The push eased, annoyed. He had the sudden childish impression of something large standing with its hands in its pockets, waiting for him to misbehave. Dalton called him in at noon. The CO's office was still a closet that pretended otherwise. Dalton didn't sit behind the desk. He stood in front of it, blocking the cheap framed photograph of a younger version of himself standing on a tarmac with an airplane that no longer flew. "Here's how this goes," Dalton said. "You stay off headsets. You stay out of cockpits. You stay out of the hangar unless someone sends for you. You sleep when told. You eat when told. You don't tell anyone your dreams. In return, no one takes your wings off your chest in a room full of men." Reyes laughed once, because the line deserved it. Dalton didn't. "You want me to act like a man who's done flying," Reyes said. "I want you to remain a man," Dalton said. "Some days those are the same order. Am I under investigation?" "Everyone is under investigation. That's what the Navy calls peacetime." "And the other investigation?" Dalton's face didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Project Sentinel," Reyes said, because he wanted to see whether the acronym hit Dalton's eyes like a thrown stone. The CO blinked like a man adjusting to wind. "Those are not squadron words." "What words are?" "Go to chow, Captain, and look like you're hungry." In the wardroom, men made space for him the way water makes space around Hull. No one avoided him. No one included him. They spoke shoulder to shoulder around him about football and wives, and the peculiar smell the heads had taken on since cold weather came back. He ate a turkey sandwich that tasted of cardboard in Providence. He drank coffee that made his heart write its name in his chest. Across the room, Carter came in, tray rattling, eyes down. He had not shaved well. A small raw patch on his jaw bled under a scab. He sat alone at a two-top and unfolded a newspaper he did not read. Reyes watched the kid's eyes track an invisible line midair, as if reading from a teleprompter only he could see. Carter lifted his cup to drink and missed his mouth by a half-inch before correcting. He set the cup down very carefully, as if it had become a complicated instrument. Reyes rose with his tray and carried it to Carter's table. He stood there, half offering, half threatening, the way men do when they have to decide whether a conversation is kindness or cruelty. "Sit if you're going to sit," Carter said without looking up. Reyes sat. The stripe in the tabletop laminate bisected them like a runway centerline. "I'm grounded," Reyes said. "Discretion," Carter said. He folded the newspaper with origami precision and set it aside. "I'm rest." "How's that different?" "In rest, they don't ask you questions. They see if your mouth keeps moving anyway." "Does it?" "Sometimes," Carter said. "In my head." They ate. The wardroom clattered around them, the living noise of a floating town. Lyle laughed too loud at something, then looked around to see whether the sound had broken any glass. "We are not flying," Carter said after a while. "We are being flown." "By what?" "By whatever keeps calling it heading." Carter's grin was brief and tired. "We're just the wires." "I refuse," Reyes said, and was surprised to hear the sentence leave his mouth without apology attached. "You did," Carter said. He looked at Reyes's hands, and the healing cut across the knuckles, the sign of the stopwatch's execution. "It heard you." "Did it?" "Now we'll try another way." Carter pushed his tray away as if distance from the food might save him from an answer. "It prefers the familiar." The phrase landed between them like a drop tool. Reyes felt the sentence fit, his jaw, like a piece of someone else's hardware. He stood so abruptly his chair stuttered back against the deck. Men looked up, then looked down again. Reyes carried his tray to the scullery and washed the plate clean with a focus he normally reserved for pre-flight checklists. When he turned, Dalton was at the hatch, watching with his arms folded and his face neutral. The CO tipped his head. "Walk with me." They went topside without speaking. The wind out of the north carried a taste of iron. Jets lined the angled deck like sleeping sharks. The wake unrolled behind the ship in two clean white lines, calligraphy on black water. Dalton leaned his forearms on the catwalk rail. "You are not grounded because I'm afraid of you, Captain," he said. "You are grounded because the ship is. It's a machine." "So are we," Dalton said. "Some machines don't tolerate stray frequency." "You believe me," Reyes said flat. Dalton didn't answer. After a while he said, "When I was an ensign, a lieutenant commander with a voice like a chainsaw told me there would come a day when the plane became the smallest part problem. I thought he was being poetic. I despise poetry." "Here we are," Reyes said. "Here we are," Dalton said. "Do not make my ship a hub for something I cannot brief." "How do I not?" "By not helping it be familiar," Dalton said. "By not being a perfect conductor." The word turned itself over in Reyes's mouth. Conductor, a wire. Conductor, a man with his back to an orchestra, summoning order from train noise. Conductor, a man who takes tickets on a train and knows every stop by its smell. "What am I, then?" he said. "If not that?" Dalton surprised him by smiling. The old kind, the kind that suggested a memory worth liking behind the eyes of a hard man. "A resistor," he said. "Every circuit needs at least one, or it burns." They watched the deck crew walk a tow bar into place under a nose wheel. The men moved with that unshowy grace of people who have been rehearsing for catastrophe since they were 19. "Where do I stand?" Reyes asked. "Behind the glass," Dalton said. "You watch. You keep your hands in your pockets. You don't touch radios. You don't nod when you feel the answer arrive before the question. You don't look heroic." He glanced at Reyes's hands. "You heel. And if it calls anyway?" "It will," Dalton said. "So you decide how loudly to refuse and in what language. And you come tell me afterward, not before." "Why after?" "Because I like to pretend luck works." Reyes laughed, and the sound felt like a moving part working again for the first time after grit. By the second deck cycle, the rumor had a name. Not Reyes. Not the corridor. Not anything fit for a log. The plane captains called it Ghost Man, in the way deckmen name anything that moves in the corner of the eye and won't hold still. Someone said Ghost Man made a yellow shirt step left before a rolling ladder would have taken his knee. Someone else said Ghost Man twitched a hand at the moment a tied-down chain came snaking loose, and a hook caught it clean in air. The superstitious crossed themselves and then denied it. The rational said ships are full of coincidences, because ships are full of men. Reyes stood glass-eyed and watched the ballet unfold and knew every beat before it hit the floor. He did not move. He pressed his hands so deep into his flight jacket pockets the fabric cut into his wrists. His jaw ached with unspent words. The push came and came. "Turn your head. Step right. Say wave off." And he held like a man braced in the doorway while a storm tested the hinges. On recovery, a phantom came in high on the ball, pilot chasing the meatball with the hunger of a man who has been out too long. Reyes felt the wave him rise in his throat like reflux. He swallowed it and looked at the LSO below, at the paddle steady in trained hands, at the professional calm of a person whose job was to say the word. The paddles flashed, elegant, authoritative. Burners lit. The jet roared over, hook sparking, and was gone to go around. The deck breathed out. Carver found him after, the way a friend finds you without making a show of it. "How's the orchestra?" he asked. "I don't turn my back to it," Reyes said. Carver grinned sideways. "Good. That's how men get hit with cellos." They stood together in the wind and let the ship decide which way to carry their words. "Dalton thinks I'm a resistor," Reyes said. Carver considered this and nodded. "Better than a fuse. Or a switch." Or a wire, Carver said, and his smile died. Don't be a wire. The PA clicked. A voice asked for a petty officer Reyes had never met. He felt the shape of the next announcement arrive like weather. He didn't listen. He watched the deck light blink, and for a moment, barely a breath, 3 strobes on the horizon answered impossibly where no aircraft flew. They winked once, mockery or benediction, or simply physics misbehaving under pressure, and were gone. He did not lift his hand. Behind him, in a ready room where his name no longer lived on the board, men wrote hours in a log and made the world official. In front of him, machines met the deck or missed it and tried again. The wind pressed a flight jacket flat against his ribs and made the paper in his inner pocket crinkle like a small animal shifting in sleep. He stayed at the glass until the deck was quiet and his jaw stopped hurting. Only then did he go below, where he sat at the metal desk and filled out forms of the gravity of a man disarming a trap. In the box labeled remarks, he wrote what the Navy would accept. No further incident. He closed the folder and held it shut with both palms as if he were holding down a lid. Alone in the passageway later, he tried the sentence on in a voice so low it might have been the ship talking to itself. You don't get my heading. The steel did not answer. Something in the steel listened. He tucked his hands back into his pockets and walked the length of the ship without choosing one time over another. The conductor kept time. The ghost man did not. He counted his steps and let the deck count with him until both of them agreed that for one more watch, the circuit would not burn. The takeoff was ordinary. That was the part that unsettled him most. No shudder in the catapult stroke, no hesitation in the engines. The Phantom leapt forward like it still belonged to him, and for a while he let himself believe it did. Altitude 25,000. Heading east, over the cold wash of sea that still carried the taste of iron. Radios clean. Gauges steady. 2 steady. Every instrument sat with a confidence that felt rehearsed. Numbers too exact. Decimals that lingered on their marks as if carved there. Even the fuel flow, always a fidgety bastard, held in saintly stillness. He tapped the glass. The needle didn't twitch. At 2044, the canopy frame dissolved. Not shattered, not ripped away. Dissolved, lines of blue-white geometry crawling across the steel, erasing it the way a child erases chalk from a board. The canopy above him became both transparent and absent, as though the air itself had taken on the duty of glass. The horizon widened. His chest tightened. Not mine, he whispered, voice a hiss behind the mask. But the lattice didn't stop. The throttle changed in his hand, metal losing its weight, becoming a rod of light that pulsed with every beat of his heart. The stick followed, lines crawling up its length, wrapping his glove until he couldn't tell whether he was holding it or whether it was holding him. He pulled right. The Phantom obeyed, but sluggishly, as if translating his motion into another language first. The altimeter numbers brightened, then dissolved, replaced by shifting symbols that hurt to look at, angles, ratios, constellations turned into arithmetic. The VSI needle floated free, untethered, a sliver of light that drifted across the panel before vanishing into the air like dust. Control, Tango lead, declaring emergency. His voice cracked the silence. The radio answered, but it wasn't human. It was himself, his own voice delayed, distorted, speaking back the same words in perfect rhythm. Declaring emergency. Declaring emergency. Declaring emergency. Then nothing. He tried the mic again. Control, do you copy? This time, the cockpit answered. Not with sound. With geometry. Lines pour across the canopy, tracing hexagons that folded inward, becoming corridors, then corridors within corridors. His body tensed as the cockpit walls thinned, replaced by a blinding lattice grid that pulsed with something like breath. The jet was still there. He felt the vibration, the shudder of airflow on wings, but his eyes told him otherwise. He sat in a chamber of light, controls fading, his knees faintly visible through his own hands. He looked down. His boots were still planted on the rudder pedals, but they were translucent, laced with veins of light that threaded up his calves. He jerked his feet back. The pedals moved on their own, adjusting trim. No, he said, louder this time, his throat raw. You don't fly me. The lattice pulsed an answer. Not refusal. Not agreement. An acknowledgement, like a teacher who had already heard the question too many times. The stopwatch appeared again. He had smashed it, broken it, buried it in silence. But there it was, floating before his face, gears glowing, hands ticking in angles rather than seconds. 275, 275, 275. The word formed without sound, pressure grinding in his jaw. Conductor. Reyes gripped the stick, what was left of it, and forced the Phantom into a dive. The canopy walls warped, light smearing like molten glass, but the jet responded. Altitude bled fast, the ocean swelling dark below. His body pressed into the harness, every tendon screaming. The lattice dimmed, flickered, then brightened again, stronger. His own arms blurred, muscles semi-transparent, bones glowing faint beneath the skin like filaments inside glass. He could see the pulse in his veins as lines of geometry echoed each heartbeat. Conductor requires surrender. He bit down so hard blood filled his mouth. Not mine, he spat, and it sprayed across his visor, red on blue-white light. For one instant, the lattice recoiled. His reflection stared back at him in the visor, human, bloodied, terrified, and whole. Then the cockpit vanished entirely. He sat suspended in nothing. The jet was gone, the ocean gone, the sky gone. Only a vast chamber of moving light remained, a cathedral of lattice stretching in every direction. His body floated within it, dissolving and reforming, light running through his fingers like wires inside glass tubes. He couldn't feel the harness anymore, couldn't feel weight, couldn't even feel fear the way he once had. Only awe, thick and paralyzing, as though he were being rewritten cell by cell. And then, like the tug of gravity returning after a dream, he slammed back into the cockpit. The panel flickered, half metal, half light. Gauges struggled to remember themselves. The throttle burned in his hand. His visor showed both sea and lattice, overlapping realities like misaligned transparencies. The stopwatch fell, clattered against the deck. This time it stayed dark. Reyes gasped. His body hurt, muscles trembling, suit drenched in sweat. He forced the Phantom into level flight, though the wings shivered like paper. The horizon was back. The ocean was back, but his hands were still glowing faintly. The lattice had left its signature inside him. He reached for the mic control. This is Tango lead. Stake, he stopped. His voice cracked, broken, as though he had already spoken elsewhere and was only repeating. The radio hissed, then steadied. A human voice at last. Tango lead, radar contact regained. You dropped for a while there. Say intentions. He looked at his hands, still pulsing faint blue in the dim cockpit. He wanted to say home. He wanted to say landing. He wanted to say anything that would erase what had happened. Instead, he whispered to the canopy, "Not mine," and the lattice listened. They called it medical review. The sign on the door said so in black block letters, taped crooked onto a frosted pane. The corridor outside smelled like antiseptic and printer toner. Reyes arrived at 9 o'clock in a clean flight suit with salt dried in the seams and a shave that drew a thin line of blood under his jaw. A petty officer with a clipboard didn't look up, only pointed with his chin. Inside, the room was bright, too bright, the light the color of new paper. A colonel waited at the head of the table. Not the same one from the ship, but cut from the same metal. Hair neat, ribbons precise, no unit patch on the sleeve, the rank doing all the talking. To his left sat a flight surgeon with a careful smile and a stethoscope he would never use. To his right, two civilians with narrow faces and wider eyes. One with neurologist calm, the other with that bureaucratic stillness that says, "I'm here to write your life into a form." A man in a gray suit set a folder on the table. Red stamp on the tab. Medical review, special case. A second stamp bled through beneath it, fainter, as if hauled up from a deeper page. Project Sentinel. Captain Reyes. The colonel said, "Sit down." Reyes sat. The chair was cold through the suit's thin cushion, or he was. The neurologist introduced himself as Dr. Harlan. The other civilian did not introduce herself. The surgeon said, "We're here to help you," with the cadence of a man saying grace over a meal he didn't want to share. The colonel folded his hands. Before we begin, the colonel said, you should know your flight status is not under discussion in this room. Then what is, Reyes said, too fast? Your condition. Silence put its hand on the small of his back and pressed. They began with the ordinary humiliations. Height, weight, pulse. Pupils and reflexes. Follow my finger right, left, squeeze my hands. Name the date, the place, the president. A clock face drawn on a clipboard with numbers that made a lopsided circle. Spell world backward, the flight surgeon said. DLRW, Reyes said in thought. A word is just a heading written with letters. They moved to questions they believed were gentle. How is your sleep? Dr. Harlan asked. Loud, Reyes said. Do you have nightmares? I prefer not to lend them the dignity of narrative. Any auditory phenomena? Voices, Reyes said, because you cannot negotiate if you pretend there is no table. Whose? Men I flew with, he said. Sometimes mine. Sometimes not quite anyone's. The neurologist wrote, without looking down. Do the voices give commands? They make offers, Reyes said, like weather does. Do you obey? I navigate. Do you hear them now? Reyes let his jaw settle, felt a familiar ache. It was there, a draft through a known crack. He thought of 2 syllables that would open a door and did not speak them. I hear this room, he said. The colonel slid the folder open. Pages inside were clipped with tidy violence. Transcripts, graphs, photostat copies of his own handwriting that he had never seen again after he'd made it. Radar returns that could not be squared with geography. A sheet on top bore the stamped subject in resonance with the indifference of a library stamp. Explain this, the colonel said, tapping. The page was a fuel curve from a week ago. Burn flat, burn spike, burn nothing, then back to flat, as if physics had turned off to tie its shoe and then remembered it was being watched. Instrument error. Reyes said, You don't think so. It's what I'm allowed to think in this room. The colonel's mouth moved as if appreciating an old joke. We can do this 2 ways, Captain. You can give me the words you know we'll accept, and I'll write them into a narrative that keeps the world clean. Or you can give me the words you're actually carrying, and I'll decide what to do with them. Reyes looked at his hands. The cuts on his knuckles had knit into thin, bright seams, lines of healing that reminded him of the lattice when he tried not to see it. He placed his palms flat on the table. I am carrying names, he said. Dr. Harlan's pen paused. Whose? He spoke them, one by one. Family names, first initials, call signs that had once been jokes and now sounded like bells. He did not speak the heading. He did not speak his own name, as if keeping it behind his teeth might keep it his. The colonel listened without expression. The nameless civilian watched Reyes's mouth, like a linguist studying a dialect. When he finished, no one said, I'm sorry. No one ever did. We'd like to run some tests, Dr. Harlan said. Electroencephalogram. Visual evoke potentials. Auditory. Nothing invasive. Nothing invasive, Reyes repeated, and the room's fluorescent hum seemed to sharpen in a way he had learned to fear. They taped the leads to his scalp. They asked him to stare at a checkerboard that inverted at a frequency designed to trick nerves. They played tones that weren't quite tones. They measured the brain's patience. The graph crawled across the page with the doctor's heartbeat. The neurologist murmured once. That's interesting. What? The colonel said. He anticipates the inversion, Harlan said. VP latency is negative. Negative, the colonel said, as if testing whether the word fit in his mouth. It's as if the brain is already aligned to the next pattern before we present it. Not predictive coding, as we understand it. Something. He stopped, remembering which room he was in. Something we don't have a column for. They ran auditory tests next. Clicks. Bursts of white noise. Recorded voices reading lists of numbers. Reyes's jaw ached in steady counterpoint. He knew which number would come before it came. The way you know a friend's laugh will break on a particular syllable. He kept that knowledge out his eyes. Do you remember corridor? The nameless civilian asked when he was back at the table. Leads peeled, scalp raw. I remember a room made of rules. Do you believe it is external to you? I believe it prefers the familiar. he said. Carter's phrase, stolen because truth doesn't respect ownership. The colonel steepled his fingers. Captain Reyes, do you believe you can be, what's the word, useful? To what? To the effort to understand and, if necessary, to neutralize this phenomenon. Reyes smiled without humor. You mean weaponized? The colonel did not blink. I mean managed. And if I say no, the colonel tapped the folder's corner, a soft syncopation. Then your world becomes very small. A clinic, a bed with sheets too clean, a view of trees you can't walk among. Your wings go into a case in a hallway where children line up to look at poster boards about honor. Your wife learns to sign forms. Your daughter learns to stop asking the sky about you. The sentence walked through him with a soldier's boots. He breathed once, slow, and set the paper square at his throat where it wouldn't blur his speech. I won't give you the heading, he said. We already have the heading, the colonel said, mildly. We can draw a straight line from any 2 points you stand on. Then what do you need me for? The colonel glanced at the nameless civilian, then back. A conductor without a grid is a lightning strike. A conductor with a grid is power. Reyes felt the room lean, the draft through the crack in his jaw deepen. The urge to correct the metaphor with something truer, I am a resistor, rose and fell. He let it pass. Dr. Harlan cleared his throat. There is a medical component, he said softly, as if offering a blanket. You are changing. Your nervous system has adapted to an input we don't understand. We can help you delimit that adaptation. You can help me stop being what you want me to be, Reyes said. Which is the thing you want me to be? Harlan looked down. The nameless civilian did not. The colonel closed the folder. You will remain on restricted duty, he said. You will report to this room at 0900 daily. You will wear no headset, touch no radio. You will not leave base without permission. You will not speak to anyone about anything that happened to you from March 11th onward except in this room. Or what? Or the small world, the colonel said again, and his voice did not need to be cruel to be true. Reyes stood, his legs held. He saluted, because muscles remember. The colonel returned it after a measurable pause, and then looked past him, already on to the next form. In the doorway, Reyes stopped. The frosted glass threw his outline back in a fraction late. He didn't wait for it to catch up. Outside, the hall smelled less like paper. Snowlight bled through a high window and made the linoleum look clean. He walked without choosing a direction until the base's perimeter fence presented itself. Beyond it, a stand of birch wore frost like armor. He put his hands in his pockets and felt the folded square of paper there, the one he had written weeks ago, with the only sentence that kept shape. If the corridor wants only the duty in us, I will give it the rest. He took it out. Read it. Folded it again. Slid it back. A raven landed on the fence post and regarded him with the flat, self-respecting stare of a creature that has learned to live at the edge of other animals' empires. Its beak clicked once. It hopped off the post and rode a gust into the gray like it had been invented to do it. He went back to the ready room. The board still didn't have his name, but the chair he had used 100 times remembered him. Carver sat 2 rows up, flipping a pencil end over end with a magician's attention. Carter slept sitting up with his mouth set like a man carrying a secret in his teeth. Reyes opened a logbook that had learned to go blank and wrote in the space the Navy allowed for honesty. Medical review completed. He paused, then added, smaller, in a hand that looked like someone else's, refused heading. He closed the book and felt the pressure in his jaw ease 1 degree, the corridor taking precise note of his imprecision. Outside, jets climbed a ladder cut into the sky. Inside, men rehearsed speeches that would be asked of them. In the space between, he existed, large enough to be offered, small enough to refuse. When he stood to leave, the PA clicked. He did not wait for the next sentence to arrive. He walked out into the wind that smelled of metal and snow and turned his head the wrong way at the corner, just to feel the world yield a fraction to a man who still believed he could. The checklist was meaningless, but Reyes went through it anyway. Switches on, fuel set, radios checked. Ritual was a language his hands still understood, even if the words no longer matched the world. He launched at 1920 into an evening sky polished flat by cold wind, the horizon a perfect knife between violet air and black sea. For the first 10 minutes, everything was ordinary. Ordinary enough that he felt the ache in his jaw like a man waiting for thunder after lightning. And then it came. The lattice did not creep this time. It unfolded, sudden, absolute. One moment he was in a cockpit. The next, the cockpit was only an echo, its outline sketched in light, then erased. The Phantom's frame bent into angles, then into ratios, then into silence. He was inside a chamber that felt both endless and precise, like standing inside the mathematics of a cathedral. The geometry ran through him, not around him, lines threading his arms, his ribs, his skull. He lifted his hand and saw a bone transparent, vessels glowing faint blue, nerves like silver filaments humming with borrowed current. He should have been afraid. He should have been fighting. Instead, he smiled, because for the first time, he wasn't being pressed into obedience. He was being invited. The lattice pulsed, a rhythm that matched his heart. Or maybe his heart matched it. The difference no longer mattered. The ache in his jaw dissolved, replaced by a weightless clarity. The voice that once hissed heading now simply existed inside him. Not command, not demand, only resonance. His instruments flickered in and out of existence. The altimeter became a spiral of numbers receding into infinity. The fuel gauge fractured into constellations. The radio dial dissolved into pure tone, a sound so low it felt like breath. He didn't reach to correct them. He let them go, like a man setting a bird free from his palm. The stopwatch appeared again, not broken, not glowing with menace. Whole, restored. It hovered at eye level, hands ticking calmly, not to seconds or degrees, but to something slower, vaster. Each tick sounded inside his bones, a deep chime. He did not smash it. He reached forward and touched it, and it folded neatly into his palm, weightless, dissolving into his skin. The corridor opened. Not a scar in the sky this time, not a wound across the sea. It bloomed ahead of him like a gate wrought of starlight, its edges bending in arcs so vast he could not comprehend them all at once. He felt no tug to enter, no compulsion, only a certainty. The gate had always been there, waiting for him to stop pretending he didn't belong to it. Not mine, he had said so many times. But now the words came back changed, softened. He whispered them again, and the lattice answered with a warmth in his chest that felt like agreement, not correction. Not yours. Ours. The Phantom dissolved completely. Wings, engines, canopy, all unmade into lines of light that folded into the structure and vanished. Reyes remained, suspended in a grid of brilliance that carried him without motion, without thrust, without drag. He had no harness. He had no weight. He had no cockpit, only a body remade in symmetry. For a moment, he thought of Dalton's words. A resistor keeps the circuit from burning. He almost laughed. He understood now that resistance had only been the first step. Every conductor resists at first, until it learns that resistance is also connection. His body pulsed with patterns. Angles spun across his skin like tattoos written in light. Inside his skull, memories rearranged themselves into ratios. He remembered his daughter's face, her laugh, her tiny hand clutching his finger. And the lattice took that memory, turned it gently, and showed him the geometry hidden even there, the symmetry of love, the measure of bond, the perfect arc of care. It didn't erase her. It made her infinite. Ahead, other figures shimmered. Not machines this time. Shapes that were once men. Flyers. Outlines draped in light. They looked at him without eyes, greeted him without voices. Some he recognized. Carter, grinning faint in luminous profile. Silhouettes that might have been names he had spoken in debrief rooms or whispered into darkness. They did not look broken. They did not look lost. They looked complete. He felt the corridor aligning him. Not forcing. Aligning. Like an instrument tuning to a key it had always meant to play in. His pulse slowed. His breath matched the rhythm. He wasn't being flown. He was flying, but not alone. Not as a man, not as a jet, but as part of something that stretched beyond sky and time. The ocean, the horizon, the ship, the ready room, all of it felt like chalk drawings washed away by rain. What remained was cleaner, sharper, realer. Reyes closed his eyes. The light didn't fade. It moved inside him, through him. He didn't need eyes anymore to see. He didn't need hands to steer. He had become what the lattice had named him, a conductor, and for the first time, it felt like the right word. They sent a sedan at 3:12. It slid to the curb outside the bachelor quarters without headlights, tires crunching frost with a patience that meant orders. 2 men got out, then a third. The driver stayed behind the wheel, engine ticking once every heartbeat like a metronome set to someone else's time. Plaid shirts under parkas, civilian camouflage, but the way they moved said range qualification, said briefing at 0-100 with coffee that tastes like nickels. They carried nothing that showed and nothing they needed to show. Inside, in a room too small to be called quarters by anyone who'd slept in a house, Reyes sat at his desk with a lamp turned down until filament glowed the color of a coal. The logbook lay open in the pool of light, the square of paper with a sentence tucked under it like a relic. He had showered and shaved and put on a clean flight suit he would not need. He had made the rack with shipboard corners, as if the bed were a thing that deserved respect even now. The stopwatch was gone. Whatever it had been was inside him, or nowhere at all. He knew they were coming before the sedan's door latches clicked. Not because he heard them, because the room exhaled. The pipes inside the wall shivered. The cheap window glass fogged with his breath, and then cleared as if pushed from the other side. He recognized the ache in his jaw and welcomed it, the way a man welcomes a pain that means the wound is closing. He picked up the logbook and, because ritual matters even when the world is ending, wrote in the remarks block with a neat hand instructors had praised in a younger man. No further incident. The ink darkened as it dried, then lightened, as if the paper could not decide what story it wanted to hold. The corridor arrived without spectacle. No seam, no crack in air, only a brightening, the way dawn brightens under a door before the sun bothers to show itself. Lines lifted out of the shadows, thin, blue-white, patient. They found corners first, the desk's edge, the doorframe's right angle, the spine of the logbook. They braided along the room's geometry as if the world had been built to be a scaffold for something bigger. Reyes set the pen down. He pressed his palm over the folded square in his inner pocket and felt the paper answer like a small animal waking. He whispered, not to the room, not to the men approaching, but to the names he'd been carrying like ballast. I'm keeping you. He said them all, last names, first initials, the cadence of ready room uses when it is about to commit men to sky. And with every syllable the lattice brightened, as if the structure acknowledged inventory. Boots in the hall, a soft cough, a hand on the knob, polite once. Politeness held as long as the rulebook required. The knob turned. The door shivered but didn't open. The frame had swollen with cold, or was something else. A second later, the abrupt courtesy of a key. The door flung inward 6 inches, and hit a resistance that was a resistance. The men on the threshold leaned their weight, and found it returned, the way ocean returns a shove with interest. Captain Reyes said a voice that could belong to a dozen colonels. Open the door. It is open, Reyes said, and it almost was. The lattice had run its lines across the gap like spider silk, not blocking, only making walking a decision. They hit it as a unit. The room admitted them one by one the way a radio admits voices on a frequency. First a man with a coat still buttoned, then a man whose hat stayed in his hand out of respect for some church he did not know he had entered. Then a third whose eyes narrowed at the light and did not widen again because a prize is an indulgence the trained are not allowed. They carried no guns that showed. They didn't need them. They had papers and tone. One set a folder on the desk's edge without asking permission. Red stamp on the tab. Medical review, special case. The fainter stamp beneath it, the one that bled through paper like a bruise, said Project Sentinel. You'll come with us now, the first man said. His calm was the institutional sort, accumulated by men who carry clipboards into rooms where others carry pain. Reyes stood. The lattice swam up to the soles of his boots, through bone, through soft tissue, drawing its patient map. His skin prickled where lines threaded into him, not invasive, not gentle. Exact. He felt the light travel his veins the way a current finds a path it prefers through copper. I will, he said, but not how you mean. "Captain," the second man said, the one who didn't look away from the glow even as it thickened. "Elias, look at me. Stay with me." Reyes looked. The man's eyes were the color of coffee that had been left on the burner too long. Behind him he could feel, just barely like a draft, the corridor's attention measuring new mouths, new jaws, calculating whether any of them fit the familiar. "You don't have to be brave," the man said. "I am tired of being a resistor," Reyes said. It sounded like a confession and like a punchline. The first man moved to take his elbow with the practice care you use on people who might tear, then snatched his hand back when fingers brushed light. His face did not change. He reached for the folder instead and opened it as if paper could be a weapon. "Your status," he said, "is unresolved. Your flight privileges are rescinded. You are to be transported to a secure medical facility. You will not resist." Reyes smiled. It was a small, rueful smile of a man remembering a joke told in bad weather. "I'm not resisting." He turned slightly so that the desk, the door, and the window made 3 points of a triangle. The lattice found the angles and stroked them until they sang. The room hummed, a low, architectural tone, and with it something inside him hummed back, like two forks tuned the same and set ringing. He touched the logbook. The page he had written on was blank again. The words had gone where words go when the future has more use for them than paper does. He closed the book and slid it into the desk drawer and shut the drawer with an ordinary clack. "Ritual, Elias," said a forward voice from the hallway, one that did not belong to the men with papers. "Carver. Of course it would be Carver, because the world still wanted symmetry. Don't do anything I'd have to eulogize with a straight face." Reyes laughed, and the laugh made the lattice brighten. "You told me not to be a wire," he called. "I did," Carver said. "And here you are, humming like one." "Maybe I'm the grid," Reyes said, and felt the words settle into the room like a truth no one had asked for. The third man, the one with the coffee eyes, took a half step forward. "Captain," he said softly, "your daughter. Think about her. Come with us so she can touch your hand. Not this." He gestured helplessly at the air, at the light. "Not this." Reyes's chest hurt the way it hurts when you try not to cry and fail. He put his palm flat over the inner pocket where the folded square lived and felt the paper's edge bite the heel of his hand. "She will touch my hand," he said, "just not as skin. I'm sorry." The lattice intensified. Lines divided into lines, each one finer, an embroidery executed by a patient god. The walls did not dissolve. They simply ceased to matter. All the room's materials, the metal, the paint, the glass, found their equivalents in angles and handed themselves over the way water hands itself over the ice without complaint. The men moved as trained men move when plans fail, and they still have to be responsible. The first reached for Reyes again, with purpose this time, the kind of purpose that ends in paperwork and regret. The second went for the radio clipped under his coat. The third did nothing but look, and in looking he witnessed, which is a work all its own. Reyes stepped backward once, and the step carried him farther than the room allows. He felt the threshold under his heel, felt the lattice catch him and hold him the way a rope catches a climber who has let go on purpose. The light carried his weight like intention. "Heading," said the corridor, not command, not inquiry. A word offered for pleasure of hearing it. He almost answered. The old syllables rose. The familiar compass shape arranged itself behind his teeth. He smiled instead and gave it the other thing he had promised to keep. "Names," he whispered, and said them all again, as the light wrote them in patterns too fine for any page. The men lunged. Hands cut through the bright like hands through steam. A shoulder struck something that felt like furniture and was not. The radio spat static and a voice that belonged to a tower that had not been built, yet telling someone to hold short. Carver swore in the language of man who had learned to swear as a craft and reached for Reyes's jacket and got only the frictionless compromise of light. It was not dramatic. No blast, no scream, no Hollywood thunder. Only subtraction. Mass removing itself from equations with the grace of a gentleman leaving a party before his story turns boring. Reyes looked last at the window. Snow had started, small, persistent flakes that learned their path from wind and land on whatever is honest. He thought of a little girl pressing her nose to glass. He thought of a woman who would fold a flag and lay it in a drawer with school photos, and the key to a car that never started right. "Not mine," he said one more time, and the corridor answered the way truth answers when you finally lean into it. "Ours." He stepped, or the room offered a step where no step had been. Light welcomed him. It entered him the way breath enters a lung, and asked nothing more than rhythm. He felt the structure move through his skull like a kind hand. He felt memory rearrange itself into ratios that did not erase what they measured. He felt the green smell of jet fuel, the weight of a helmet, the way deck steel hums under night, the tick of a watch that had never been meant to count anything but minutes. All of it kept, none of it lost. The men hit the space he had just occupied and found only air. The folder slid off the desk and spilled paper that tried to decide between inertia and testimony. The lamp flared and then steadied. The logbook, shut in the drawer, warm like a small animal asleep in winter. Carver's hand came down on nothing. He stood very still. He did not say God. He said, "Okay," the way a man says it when a universe has been perfectly clear and courtesy requires you to answer. The room's glow faded to sodium yellow, to cheap bulb, to human dark. The lattice did not retract so much as become elsewhere. A smell of ozone hung between metal and paint. The second man lowered his radio slowly, as if fast motion might tear the page that had replaced the room. Outside, the sedan idled. A raven landed on the roof rack, tilted its head, considered snow with scientific disdain, and lifted off again, as if nothing worth eating would come of this. In the hallway, men gathered and pretended they had not. The word vanish would be used later by people who prefer verbs that apologize for not having photographs. A form would be filled out. The box of no further incident would be checked because that is the box the Navy built. On the desk, beneath a drift of thin paper and authority, the remarks block on a different page of the logbook, one no one would think to open for a week, faded from blank to a sentence written in a hand that was almost Reyes's and almost not. "You are not alone." By then, in a room that was not a room, the geometry would have learned the last thing it needed from him, and he from it. That a conductor is not a man who gives up his name, but a man who learns how to carry more than one. At 3:19, the sedan left with 3 men and the absence of 4th. Snow stitched the tire tracks, shut in a patient cursive. The base returned to routine, the way it always does, the way it must. Somewhere a coffee pot burned itself honest. Somewhere a ladder creaked under a plane that would fly anyway. The logbook cooled. The corridor kept time.